Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's hearing. Today we're going to hear evidence from Dame Melanie Dawes, who at the time of the fire was the Permanent Secretary at the Department for Communities and Local Government. Yes, Mr. Millett.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, good morning. Good morning, members of the panel. I now call, please, Dame Melanie Dawes.
Good morning, Dame Melanie. You're going to make the affirmation, I understand. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
Thank you. Well, the words are there on the screen. Would you read them out, please?
I do solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much. Now, please sit down and make yourself comfortable. Is that chair not...
Just bring it down slightly.
All right.
Thank you.
Okay. Yes, Mr. Millett.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dame Melanie, good morning. And can I start by thanking you very much for coming yet again to give evidence to the public inquiry. We're extremely grateful to you. You are, I think, one of a handful of factual witnesses who have been asked and have been good enough to come more than once. So you will know what I'm about to tell you, but I will nonetheless repeat it. First, could I ask you please to keep your voice up so that the transcriber can get your evidence down clearly on the transcript. Also, not to nod or shake your head. You have to say yes or no, as the case may be. We'll be taking breaks during the course of the day at the usual time, but if you feel you need a break at any other time, we can take a break. And finally, if there's anything I ask you which you don't understand or you would like me to repeat or put in a different way, I can do that. Now, you've made 3 statements to the inquiry, the first 2 of which relate to this module, Module 4, and your third statement relates to Module 6, which you were asked about by Kate Grange, Queen's Counsel, when you gave evidence in Module 6 in March of this year. I won't be asking you about that statement, but I will be asking you about your first 2 statements, which will appear on the screen in front of you, as will all the documents to which I'm going to take you. Let's go to that first statement then. It's at CLG 3030653. Is that your first witness statement, dated the 20th of May 2019?
Yes, it is.
And if we go please to page 39, you can see a signature above the date. Is that your signature?
Yes, it is.
Your second statement, CLG 3030784, dated the 3rd of November 2020. Is that the first page of your second witness statement?
Yes, it is.
Thank you. And if we go please to page 15, you can see a signature there above the date. Although it's an electronic signature, can you please confirm that it is yours?
Yes, it is mine.
Thank you. Have you had the opportunity to read these statements recently?
Yes.
And can you confirm that the contents of each of these statements is true?
Yes.
Thank you. Now, I just want to ask you 1 or 2 further questions about your background. We've heard quite a lot of evidence already about it, but just to confirm, at the time of the fire at Grenfell Tower in June 2017, you were the Civil Service Head of the Department for Communities and Local Government, DCLG, yes?
Yes.
Yes. And that was a role I think you had held since the 1st of March 2015.
Yes.
And you left that post in February 2020, yes?
Yes.
At the time of the fire, then, you were, is this right, responsible for the overall leadership and management of the department?
Yes, at the civil service level, yes.
At a civil service level, yes. Now, looking at the structure of the DCLG at the time of the fire, is it right that there were 3 commands across the department, each led by a Director General?
Yes, that's correct.
And we've heard a little bit of that in Module 6, but just to recap and help me with this and confirm, the first of those commands, I think, was Housing and Planning, led by Helen McNamara, yes?
Yes.
And the second was Local Government and Public Services, led by Dr. Jo Farrer, yes? And we heard from her yesterday. And is it right that the third was was Simon Ridley, leading on economic growth and devolution?
Yes.
Yes. And I think there were also 3 director-led commands who oversaw corporate activities, including finance, human resources, and strategy.
Yes.
That's correct, is it?
Yes, it is correct.
Yes. And they all reported to you, did they?
Yes.
In relation to ministers, I think it's right that the department had 5 ministers of state, yes?
I believe so. Sometimes we had 6, sometimes we had 5 during that period, but yes, I think it was 5 at the time.
Very well. And one of those ministers at the time was Alok Sharma MP, who was Minister of State for Housing and Planning.
Yes.
Yes. And he, I think, was appointed on the 13th of June 2017, so the day before the fire.
Yes, in the evening.
In the evening?
Yes.
Right. So he was in post for a matter of hours?
Yes.
And is it right that the Secretary of State for the department was Sajid Javid MP?
Yes.
And he had been appointed on the 14th of July 2016, so he'd been in post for 9 months or so.
Yes, he was reappointed after the general election in 2017.
Reappointed after the general election, happened, I think, on the 8th of June.
Yes.
And they were both key ministers in responding to the Grenfell Tower fire, yes?
Yes, they were.
Now, if you go, please, to your first witness statement, page 36, paragraph 120, you say this. At the foot of the page, you say, in addition, the fact that some ministers were newly appointed also made their jobs harder in the early days, as they learnt about the issues for which they were responsible at the same time as getting to grips with the situation created by the fire. In my opinion, the department was very lucky to have Alok Sharma and Sajid Javid as our two key ministers at the time. The fact that the Secretary of State already knew the department and had strong working relationships with the senior team was essential. His and Alok Sharma's wholehearted commitment to helping the individuals and families affected was clear from the start. Now, was it your, or is it your recollection that the very recent appointment before the fire of the Minister of State for Housing and Planning, namely Alok Sharma, had an impact in any way on the department's ability to respond to the fire?
Well, it certainly had an impact on Alok Sharma himself. He arrived, to the best of my recollection, for the first time in the department on that Wednesday morning, and of course was dealing with some of the issues in North Kensington, but was also the lead Minister of State on all the issues to do with building safety that we were dealing with at the time. So he had a very, very steep learning curve to get through. I believe my colleagues in the department, and particularly Helen McNamara, was supporting him, did a very good job in helping him with that, but he had an enormous amount of material to absorb. I think he did that extremely well, but I'm sure he would have wished that he'd had, more time to get across the brief before the crisis hit.
I mean, looked at coolly, did the gradient of his learning curve have an adverse effect on his response to the fire, or the department's ability, perhaps, to respond to the fire in the early hours?
I can't honestly think of any issue where Alok's newness in the role made a difference. I spoke to him a number of times, and I thought he was very, very quick to get to the heart of the issues that he was addressing. But, as I said, it made his life a lot harder. I should add that the Prime Minister had no choice but to appoint a new housing minister, because Gavin Barwell had been housing minister but had lost his seat in the general election the previous week. So the vacancy had to be filled somehow.
Right. I'm going to turn to a different subject. Before I do, can I just ask you, your voice is coming through a little bit dim, so where I'm
sorry.
sitting, and it may just be the angle to which you're sitting, so far as the microphone is concerned.
Let me try.
That's better.
Okay, my apologies.
Not at all.
Right.
That's better. Thank you. Now, can I turn then to the subject of RED? Now, it's right that within the DCLG, and that may be a question, sits something called RED, the Resilience and Emergencies Division. Is that right?
Yes.
Did you have a role in the operating function of RED in June, or as at June 2017?
Not specifically, no. I was not part of the command structure, but RED was located within DCLG, and as I think you may be hinting, it was effectively a cross-government resource, and that's how I always saw it. And it was part of the overall civil contingencies machinery, which was, of course, headed and led at a strategic level and at an operational level in the Cabinet Office, but RED's role was at the local level to do the liaison with local resilience fora, and then in a crisis to be the main point of liaison between central and local government. So I always saw RED as effectively pointing towards the overall Cabinet Office leadership, but the people were clearly part of our department, and their leadership individuals were part of my senior team.
I think you've answered my next question, but just to tick them off, Catherine Richardson, Deputy Director,
Yes.
reported to you.
Yes, she reported to Gillian Kay, who reported to Joe Farrer.
Right, perfect. That exactly. Then turning to the function of DCLG, well, Well, sorry, before I move on, did any of those individuals report across government, for example, to anybody in the CCS?
No, I don't think they did. I think that's a good question. I think Gillian Kay had wider responsibilities and not just for RED as a director. Catherine Richardson's role was entirely within RED. But I don't recall there being anything like a dotted line, for example, which could have provided some management oversight and feedback and so on as part of performance reporting. I don't recall that, and I think it's a good question as to whether that could have been helpful.
Thank you. Now then, looking at DCLG and its function, what is the department's function when an emergency occurs? It's a broad question, but can you enlighten us?
Well, firstly, there is RED, of course, and their main function is to provide liaison between local responders and the centre of government, and of course that varies depending on the nature of the crisis, but that's one part of what DCLG was supposed to do, as I say, very much on behalf of the Cabinet Office. And then we also held a number of, if you like, capabilities. So I would include in that the Bellwyn financing scheme. We were there to hold that system and to work out when that financing system needed to be deployed in response to a request from local responders, local government. In addition to that, and I think some of this was not as clear as it could have been at the time, if I'm honest, there was, of course, the National Risk Assessment and the National Risk Register. And DCLG, as then had been the recovery lead for some emergencies over the preceding years. And I particularly remember the floods of 2015, 2016 over that winter when we took up the recovery lead role. I remember that being a decision that was taken at the time. It wasn't automatic, but I knew at the time that the fire hit that we were likely to have a role in coordinating cross-government efforts on recovery. But I don't believe that was as clear at the time, to be honest, as it might have been. And then finally, there were certain risks on the National Risk Register of which we were a part. I think in 2016, 2017, we were the designated lead government department for response for returning British nationals or others arriving from overseas, but not in any other risk. And so we had capabilities in RED able to discharge that risk should it have materialised and should we have needed to swing in to lead any government response on it.
Right. In light of that answer, was RED the DCLG element which might respond in the response phase to emergencies arising out of risks other than returning nationals?
I don't think so, no, not automatically anyway. So I would draw a distinction between RED, which was a capability for the whole of government and very much part of the overall system of oversight for civil contingencies headed by the Cabinet Office. By the way, I should add that one thing I don't think was a problem here was a lack of such a system or of an understanding of it in the way that there was a lack on building safety. It's quite different. There was a system. I think the question is whether or not it had any holes in it which need to be addressed and still haven't been addressed. But perhaps we'll come on to some of that. But I would distinguish between that role and the role that we then played in the days following the fire on what I would call the department's core responsibilities. So that included housing, including temporary accommodation, and it included some of the things we did in working with other departments to set up the victims unit later in the week. And we could have, and sort of did lodge that victims unit alongside the RED capabilities, but I don't think it would ever be automatic for the department to have it. I think it's quite important to have a separation between RED and its role and things the department might do as part of a response or recovery effort alongside.
Yes, I see. We may come back to the victims unit later in your evidence.
Yes.
And examine what happened there. But coming back to the question of recovery, which you've mentioned, was it the case that DCLG's involvement in the recovery phase after an emergency be dictated by the National Risk Register?
So my recollection is that the National Risk Register had us as the recovery lead for floods, and I think the understanding was that we were likely to be the recovery lead for other crises, particularly those happening at a local level, which are being led by a local authority on the ground. But I don't remember that latter, more general default role for DCLG really being written down, and I'm not sure it was very clear.
I see. Well, let's look at that a little bit more closely in looking at the lead government department. Just before I do that, do you remember at the time of the fire, was DCLG involved in any other recovery phase, any other emergency?
We had, through RED, mobilised throughout the summer following a series of terror attacks at London Bridge and in Manchester, and also earlier in the year, I recall, Westminster Bridge. Am I right about that? But perhaps the timing was different. But there had been a series of other attacks. So we had mobilised quite a lot along with the rest of Whitehall in response to those events.
Right. And does that mean that your staff in RED were, to some extent, already deployed in the recovery processes after those emergencies?
I don't recall whether there was very much by way of recovery for Manchester and London Bridge. Right. My recollection is that the local authority and other responders were very much leading on that. One small thing that we were still involved with was the remaining work following the floods of 2015-2016, because there was continued support needed for local families, local businesses, and we were still holding a very small and I believe almost complete set of actions and duties on that.
Did the continuing role of the DCLG, or RED perhaps, but I think DCLG generally, in attending to the recovery phase of those emergencies have an adverse effect on resourcing in order to deal with either the response or the recovery phase of the Grenfell Tower fire?
I don't think so, no. But those who were more directly involved in it would, I would not want to disagree with them if they said they did feel it had had an impact, because they would be better placed to say. I think what definitely was the case was that people were very tired. There had been a series of events to respond to, and of course there was the Finsbury Park attack the following week as well. So I think it had been a relentless few months for RED and indeed for the Civil Contingencies Secretariat and the Cabinet Office.
Now, turning then to the topic of lead government department, we've heard evidence from Catherine Hammond from the CCS about that. At the time of the fire, was DCLG acting as the lead government department in any other existing emergency?
Apart from the very small remaining legacy issues on the floods, no.
And what did you understand the role of the lead government department to be?
The lead government department for response, is that what you're referring to, or recovery?
Well, take
the two
first.
Okay, so the lead government department for response, of course DCLG didn't really have any of those responsibilities apart from that quite narrow question of handling people arriving from overseas. But my understanding is that such a department should have got plans in place, should have thought about the sorts of issues that would arise, should be thinking about who they were turning to lead the recovery effort as part of their response planning, and would be liaising with the Cabinet Office on working out whether or not the COBRA machinery needed to be mobilised or any cross-government ministerial meetings needed to be mobilised in response to a crisis.
And as recovery?
As recovery, that really does depend, and of course a lot of the time there isn't a particular need for central government to get involved in recovery, but there I would expect the recovery department to be owning whatever the cross-government set of activities were that needed to be carried out. And if it was only maybe one department involved, I wouldn't necessarily expect there to be a very big cross-government recovery effort to be needed. But for something like Grenfell Tower, or indeed the floods, you've got lots of departments involved, the business department and all sorts around the table, and so the role of the recovery department is to coordinate that with support from CCS in the first instance, but actually in the end operating on their own, because typically you're talking about these things continuing over a long period of time.
Dr. Farrer told us, I think yesterday, that the role of a lead government department was to act as first point of contact, but not to be operational on the ground.
Oh yes, that's absolutely clear. I should have said that already, really. The key principle within all the civil contingencies guidance and planning is that of locally led response in terms of the substantive response that's needed to support the communities that are affected.
Now, can I show you a document? HOM 30130085, please. This is a document entitled Department's Responsibilities for Planning, Response and Recovery from Emergencies, March 2009. Were you familiar with this document?
Not particularly, no.
It's a document, as you can see, prepared in March 2009, but Catherine Hammond told us in her evidence that she thought it was still current as of June 2017. Would that accord with your recollection?
Yes, especially if Catherine had confirmed that.
Right. I see. So you can't do better than her. You can't confirm or...
No, I can't really add anything to her recollection, no. She was much closer to that and to the operational leadership of it.
Right. Let's then go to page 5, please. Item 10, bottom of the page, hazardous materials, chemical, biological or radiological materials released other than as a result of terrorist activity and where not covered in 9 above or 11 below. 9 above is radiation hazards, and 11 below, take this from me, is serious industrial accidents. And you can see from that the lead government on recovery, the columns I should just explain are risk in the left-hand column, central column is response, and right-hand column is recovery. The CLG is the lead government department for recovery, where mainly displaced people or wider disruption occurs in relation to an event from a hazardous material. Does that accord with your recollection?
Yes, it does.
And over the page, if we look at item 11, serious industrial accidents, you can see there that it says A to C, which is impact on transport, impact on power, impact on built environment. HSE, wider economic and commercial impact, pollution arising from. If you look at the very top on the right-hand side, it says CLG, if wide-ranging issue. You see that?
Yes.
And then item 12, severe storms and weather. A to C is impact on transport, impact on power, impact on built environment. And then on the right, in the right-hand column, A to C, significant recovery activity unlikely, and lead likely, therefore likely to remain with response lead department unless otherwise determined if wide-ranging consequences arise. Now, they are examples, I think, of where the DCLG is listed as a lead in the response.
In the recovery.
In the recovery phase, as LGD. Would that accord with your recollection, looking at this document?
Well, yes, it would. I think, though, that it's important to say that those are all conditional statements, if wide-ranging issues, if significant displacement of people on the previous page. So my understanding at the time was that there was probably a default, and I believe Catherine Hammond said this in one of her witness statements, a default that DCLG would lead recovery in these sorts of circumstances, but I don't think it was automatic. And that was why on the morning of the fire I rang Jo Farrer, or messaged her first thing, to say, I think we'll be leading the recovery here. Because I didn't think it was automatic, and I thought it was quite important that we stepped in straight away and didn't wait to be asked. And that's what we did. However, I don't think it was clear, and I don't recall at any point anybody asking us to do that. And I don't particularly, in fact, I don't at all recall the Home Office asking us, as the lead department for response after Grenfell, talking to us as the recovery partner.
Right.
We just did it.
Right. Now, just looking to the central column, the reason I asked you about response is because if you look at C, impact on built environment, England, the response phase is with the CLG in the response phase. You see that?
In response to severe storms and weather, yes.
So that is an example, isn't it, where the CLG is the lead government department in the response phase, albeit in a particular impact arising as a result of severe storms and weather.
Yes, I have to say that I don't recall that happening during the floods of 2015, when there was an impact on the built environment in the sense that people had to leave their homes and businesses had to leave their businesses.
Yes.
But DEFRA were firmly in the lead on the response. What we picked up was the recovery issues.
Right. I see. And then if you go over the page to item 15, page 7, you can see earthquakes, and there England CLG in the response phase. Yes?
Yes, I'm not sure that that row was still there by the time of the 2016 risk assessment.
Right.
Earthquakes, I mean. I don't recall that.
Right. And if you go finally to page 9, please, item 24, this I think is the instance you were referring to before, which is reception and housing of UK citizens evacuated from overseas, England CLG, in both phases.
Yes.
Both response and recovery.
Yes, and the department held capability to be able to respond in those circumstances through RED.
Right. Now, looking at item 24 there, can you tell us whether the response and recovery for DCLG in the reception and housing of UK citizens evacuated from overseas would entail DCLG's involvement in housing those who'd been displaced?
Yes, I think it would have done. In my time in DCLG, I don't recall this becoming relevant, but I did, when I was at the Cabinet Office prior to that, pick up as one of my duties leading the emergency planning for Eurozone scenarios, which included the possibility of countries in the Eurozone leaving the Eurozone and all the potential monetary and fiscal consequences that could have resulted from that, which may well have led to citizens being evacuated and coming home to the UK. And so I remember at the time coordinating that from the Cabinet Office, requiring DCLG to have their plans ready, and that was definitely about liaising with local authorities. And it was quite challenging because you didn't know where exactly people might come home to and what their housing needs might be. So I remember those discussions at that point.
And I've shown you, I think, 3 examples of where the CLG is lead department in the response phase. Severe storms and weather impact on built environment, earthquakes, and reception and housing of UK citizens evacuated from overseas. Each of those, I think, would have a rehousing aspect, wouldn't they?
Yes, they would. I'm really not sure, though, that the earthquakes or indeed the built environment in response to storms were still there at the time of the 2016-17 risk register. My apologies if I'm wrong about that, but my recollection is that the risk register slightly changed and that what was left was this one here under row 24. But yes, you're right, it would have involved different forms of rehousing challenge. But I do, yes, and that would have been as much a recovery thing as a response issue.
It appears that this, as Catherine Hammond told us, this document remained the same in June 2017 as it had in March 2009. On that basis, just looking at the paperwork, it seems as if the DCLG did have a lead role in the response phase of an emergency in those 3 instances. And each of those, would you accept, involved as an outcome, potentially, mass displacement of individuals from their homes?
Yes, I would accept that. And indeed, I observed that during the floods. There were lots of people who needed to be rehoused locally in the floods of 2015, 2016. And that was managed quite effectively, as I recall, by the local councils, of which there were many, which were involved.
Yeah, just help us with this. Is there, or do you know whether there was a system in place whereby this document would be updated annually or biennially to reflect revisions in the National Risk Register?
Well, the reason why I am perhaps a little bit, confused by this is that my understanding was that the National Risk Register was updated quite frequently, and that the most relevant version at the time of the Grenfell Tower fire was an update from early 2017, for which the work had been done mostly during 2016, and that had changed the risks that compared to the ones shown in this document. So I'm not going to disagree with those who are closer to this about which document was extant at the time, but my understanding was that the most relevant risk register was much more recent than this one.
Now, thank you. Now, if we go to your first statement, we can move on with the point, I think. Paragraph 14, please, page 5. You say there, in the first bullet point, there was no precedent for an emergency that left so many households homeless and in crisis. While the department was not involved in providing emergency and temporary accommodation, we were quickly drawn into the longer-term rehousing challenge. I cannot recall another occasion when the department had to work with the council on long-term rehousing of individual families in this way. Would you agree that it's envisaged from the list of lead government departments that we've just been looking at that the DCLG are or are supposed to be involved in the recovery phase, at least, where complex matters or wide-ranging issues are involved, particularly housing?
Yes, if those issues are presented in response to events. However, I think you would always expect the council to be leading on those rehousing efforts, as indeed they did after Grenfell Tower. Even after the first week or so, they were still in the lead. So the department's role would have been to think about what support might be needed. I still cannot recall any event where the department had to lean in so extensively on the longer-term rehousing challenge, and that was for a number of reasons after Grenfell, not least the fact that this was the most expensive housing market in the country that we were dealing with, and the need to rehouse people close to where they had lived before made it an extremely difficult challenge and a very expensive one, which was why the government lent in with so much resource. So I still think, I stand by this bullet, I still think that there was no precedent for quite the circumstances that we were faced and that the council was faced with after the Grenfell Tower fire.
Right. Well, let's just see if we can take that in stages. First, would you agree that it was envisaged from the documents we've been looking at that the DCLG would be involved in the recovery stage where people were displaced? There was mass displacement.
Yes, in those circumstances, although I can't think of an example where that had happened, and where permanent rehousing was needed. Because after the floods, this was temporary rehousing, not permanent rehousing that was needed.
Yes, but we've also seen that the displacement could include housing of UK citizens evacuated from overseas.
Yes, to the extent that any government or local government support was needed for that, that was potentially something that the government might have needed to have got involved in, yes.
And do you agree that that could reasonably involve very large numbers of people?
Well, as I said earlier, it could have done, but I think the circumstances of Grenfell, where there was a very large number of people requiring social housing, in other words, provided by the state and paid for and subsidised by the state in a local area, and with so many others whose homes were also damaged from the other buildings surrounding Grenfell, I would not have expected for example, the movement of people following a Eurozone crisis to have had that same local, very intense impact and need for the housing teams locally. That was, I think, quite unusual. And in the case of floods, often you're talking about people who own their own homes and whose first port of call will, yes, perhaps be to go to hotels provided for by their local council, but again, not with the same level of trauma. I think that's the other thing that's important, that was very different about Grenfell, that just made the whole set of circumstances so difficult and so much more in need of central government support in a number of different respects.
What I'm really trying to get at is whether you might agree that the displacement of large numbers of people was an outcome which the department might reasonably have anticipated, given its predetermined role in the recovery phase of a number of emergencies.
Yes, I think we might have anticipated it, but I don't think we had experienced it before.
No, that I follow, and you say there's no precedent for an emergency, but the fact that there wasn't a precedent for an emergency with an outcome of this scale, I think you're accepting, is this right, is not itself a reason for not anticipating it and preparing for it.
No, but I think to have anticipated this particular set of circumstances would have been quite surprising. I think for a reasonable worst-case scenario, planning to have anticipated this, and I've just, mention the words in crisis. People were homeless and in crisis following an unbelievably traumatic set of events. So I'm not denying that some of the planning would have been useful, but I think in response to Grenfell, it's unlikely that it would have taken us to quite the situation that was being experienced.
Are you drawing a distinction in your evidence between reasonably anticipating mass displacement as an outcome as a result of floods in those parts of the country where they have been experienced, on the one hand, and mass displacement of densely housed individuals in social housing in an urban environment on the other?
In part, yes. And I think I'm also thinking of other previous events, such as, for example, Lakanal House, which I was not involved in and I have no recollection of myself. But my understanding there is that the local council managed that rehousing effort. At least I'm not aware of any particular issues surrounding that at the time. So I think a lot of what the department was thinking in working out how to prepare for any potential recovery leads that we might have had was a reasonably good track record of local councils actually managing any local rehousing need pretty well on their own. And indeed, the following week, the week following the Grenfell Tower fire, we saw Camden Council rehouse hundreds of people following the evacuation of the 5 blocks because there were fire safety issues on that Friday, the week following the fire. And there was a panel under response, hotels were provided, people were looked after, and there was no need on that occasion for central government to get involved at all. We were aware of what was going on, but we weren't involved at all. So I think there was a very strong track record, actually, of local councils being quite effective at rehousing people, both temporarily and in the rare circumstances that were needed permanently.
Does that answer tell us, and tell me if I've misunderstood your evidence, Dame Melanie, but does that tell us that the degree and nature of the preparation of DCLG for mass displacement following an emergency was conditioned upon the role that the local authority might play in the first instance?
Well, yes, it would always be conditioned on the role that the local authority would be expected to play first. They were the ones with the housing duties, they were the first responders, and we would always have expected them to be discharging their duties, and in this case, very specific duties in relation to housing homeless people, in fact. So I don't think it's really that surprising that the department had not previously stepped in on a rehousing challenge like this, and therefore was not particularly expecting that it needed to in response to Grenfell Tower. I think with the benefit of hindsight, the scale of the rehousing challenge was so immense and the trauma of those who needed to be rehoused was so extreme that this was categorically different in the sense that it was in a different category of crisis. And I think we recognised that quite early, actually, on the Wednesday and began to sweep in on the housing issues. And indeed, that was the one thing where the council did say that they needed help. And I think they realised that particularly the longer-term challenge was going to be something where they needed financial support.
Now, looking at the list, and we don't need to go back to it, I don't think, unless you'd like to, but looking at the 2009 list of relevant government departments for both response and recovery, is it right that there was no lead government department for fire?
Yes, that's my recollection, yes.
Do you know why that was?
No.
Did you ever ask that question at the time?
No.
Now, we know that in the response phase following the fire at Grenfell Tower, the Home Office was the lead government department, yes?
Yes.
And do you know why they were the lead government department?
Well, my understanding is that fire was added to the National Risk Register later, and not a fire specifically in a tower block in an urban area, but in a more general sense, and that the Home Office, as the lead government department for fire, were given that lead government department role for the response.
So is it right there was therefore a policy, that, or convention perhaps is a better word, whereby the response would sit with the department into whose remit the event creating the emergency fell?
That seems to have been the case, yes.
So for fire, is this right, after January 2016, that was the Home Department?
Yes.
But before the transfer of the responsibility for fire to the Home Department, that would have been DCLG.
Yes, that's right.
And in respect of the recovery phase after Grenfell, we're told that DCLG became the lead government department.
Yes.
That's right, is it?
That is correct.
Do you know when exactly, or even not exactly, but within a reasonable time frame, DCLG took over the role of lead government department?
Do you mean after Grenfell
After the Grenfell Tower fire, yes.
Well, no, I don't think it's very clear, to be honest. And I think there is a wider point here that the Home Office were the lead government department, but I think they saw that role primarily as observing and checking the blue light response. And in the early ministerial meetings, it was the fire and police representatives who were those who were most being called upon to provide information, is my recollection. I wasn't at the first two ministerial meetings, but that was certainly what I was told, and that's what I observed at the later meetings. So I think the Home Office's role as lead government department was seen by them as fairly narrow. I think that on the recovery side, as I was saying earlier, and as I mentioned in my witness statement, one of the first things I did on that morning was to contact Joe Farrer and say, we will be leading on the recovery, I believe. And I did that because Joe had been in the department for 10 months, but had not, to the best of my recollection, experienced a major crisis through which DCLG would be responding. And I just wanted her to be really clear that that was my expectation. I don't recall, though, any moment in the subsequent days where the Cabinet Office, in the form of CCS, actually said, you know, who's doing the recovery phase? It's you, DCLG. Please explain to us how you're doing this work. We just simply stepped into that space. And I can see, having read others' witness statements, that I think they began to return to that recovery question really on the Saturday. That's in Catherine Hammond's witness statement. And at that point, I began to have conversations with Mark Sedwell about the recovery phase and how it should look, and whether or not we needed a designated gold lead for Whitehall as a whole.
Well, we'll come to the events a little bit more closely later on. Just for the moment, can you tell us what were DCLG's responsibilities, as you understood them at the time, of DCLG as a lead government department in the recovery phase?
Our role would have been to coordinate a wider cross-government effort. I think that's the sort of thing we did on the victim support side, for example. And also in making sure that issues like immigration issues for some of the families, all of those practical questions like driving licenses and bank accounts and benefits payments, those were areas where the Cabinet Office was leading in the first instance, but where I would have expected quite a long tail of recovery work potentially, and that we would have been in the lead in coordinating that. I would also have expected that we would have been in the lead anyway, even if someone else was leading the recovery on the housing issues, which we were.
Now, would you agree, I think you do, that in ensuring the right arrangements for the recovery phase should be in place already as a standing preparedness for any lead government department responsible for recovery?
Yes, I do.
Yeah. Now, if we go to your first statement, please, again, and go to page 5 and stick with that, go up a paragraph to paragraph 13, you say there, some elements of the department's contribution to the response to and recovery from the Grenfell Tower fire were therefore well rehearsed. The red teams performed their usual role, Bellwyn was activated very quickly, and the department took on the role of coordinating the central government contribution to recovery, a role it continues to have. Mm-hmm. Was there any aspect which you considered was not well rehearsed?
Well, I think on the housing side, we had not previously thought through what a longer-term rehousing challenge might look like on this scale. And I think the scale matters, because if it was only a few families, I don't think we would have needed to have been involved. But it was the numbers and the extreme circumstances in which those people were in that made this so difficult. And so we had not rehearsed before what we would do if there was a huge rehousing challenge in a very, very expensive local authority that had almost no spare social housing. And I'm not sure, to be honest, that that kind of scale of challenge is really what is anticipated by the scenarios in the National Risk Register either. I think that government as a whole had a presumption that the local authority would normally deal with that. And I think we were ready, actually, although we were not rehearsed, we were ready to respond to that housing challenge, and we were able to send some people to help. And we were also ready, with finance. The Homes and Communities Agency stepped in to help try to find actual homes and to work with developers towards that. So we were ready, and I think we deployed quickly, but we were not rehearsed on that longer term rehousing challenge, which, as I said, I believe was unprecedented to the best of my knowledge and recollection.
Can I just ask, did you have any plans, put it that way, as to where you would go to find all this additional housing?
No, we didn't.
No one had given much thought to how you obtain it?
No, and of course the Homes and Communities Agency didn't have a role in London anyway, so even if we had had a plan, it would almost certainly not have covered London as well as it would have covered other parts of England. I think you always have to think with planning as to what the scenarios are that you're planning for. And I still believe that the number of circumstances in which a local authority can't manage this on their own are going to be very small and quite exceptional. And so if this had happened even in another urban conurbation like Birmingham or Manchester, the Homes and Communities Agency, I'm sure, would have stepped forward to talk to the council, because the HCA owns land, it's often developing sites, it has a very strong relationship with local developers, and offering that help is something it would have been able to do. Should it have been doing more planning in advance for performing that role? I'm not sure whether that would have helped, if I'm honest, because they had a capability, we deployed it quite quickly, and it did actually make a difference, albeit that nothing was really able to cope with the scale of the problem that we were facing.
Right, thank you.
Can I just tease out a further distinction arising from what you've just said? I mean, in your statements at paragraph 13 and 14 here, you have said what was well rehearsed, and then said in other respects the department's contribution to the relief effort was unprecedented. So I think, would this be fair to you that your explanation for those elements which were not well rehearsed were the unprecedented nature of the outcome?
Yes.
Right. Now, to what extent in the outcome was there a difference in that lack of preparedness between, on the one hand, Grenfell Tower being social housing, and on the other hand, another building in the borough being privately owned and full of tenants, leaseholders owning their own flats?
Well, I think there is a difference, and it's a number of different factors that create the difference. I mean, in the private sector, where people own their own homes, then there will be insurance, and people are not looking to the government to provide them with a long-term housing solution. I think that is one very important difference. I think the other difference is that some of the families in Grenfell Tower were there as temporary accommodation, so they were already actually involved with the council's housing department, and had an expectation that I think was justified that the council was going to step in and support them very, very quickly. And so I think just the nature of social housing is very different. So I think the obligation on the authorities was different, and particularly on the local authority, and that's partly a legal point in terms of temporary accommodation, but it's also just the nature of what families needed.
So was the thinking at the time, doing the best you can, that there was no need to include mass displacement of social tenants as a result of a disaster in their building, because the response of the local council was reliable enough to take up the recovery phase?
Well, I think the assumption was, firstly, that the local authority was responsible, Secondly, that this was an area where local government was very clear in its responsibilities, and despite the fact that the situation at the time was very challenging, especially in London, and we were certainly aware that there were real challenges for local authorities in finding temporary accommodation that was adequate or permanent accommodation, we believed that they knew what they had to do. And so from that point of view, I wouldn't have expected the department to feel that it needed to be looking over the shoulder of local authorities and checking that they were dealing with certainly the temporary response to a housing challenge. And on a more permanent response, you've got a bit more time there to think about the issues, and I would have expected a local authority to come to us and say, this is where we need help, not least because it's often going to be involving financial help, which may be beyond their means, which indeed is what happened even to Kensington and Chelsea. I hope that's helpful.
But it's fair to say, I think, is it, from your understanding of the civil contingencies framework, that even if a privately owned block had suffered the same disaster as Grenfell Tower had, RBKC, assuming that it had happened in that borough, would be a Category 1 responder?
Yes, of course. And hotel accommodation, certainly the wider range of support that might be needed for people, you would have expected the council to be able to provide all of those things. But and I'm speaking beyond any direct knowledge and about a scenario that I'm not aware of having really happened in quite the same way. But you would have, I think when people own their own properties, they have recourse to funding and insurance that is different and a different expectation from of what the local authority is expected to offer them and indeed what they want to be offered.
So does it come to this, and maybe I'm putting it a little bit bluntly, but when it came to preparedness for the outcome of mass displacement as a result of a fire or perhaps structural collapse of a tower block, DCLG's preparedness was adversely affected by an assumption first that it was privately owned, the tenants were insured and could look after themselves, but if it was social housing, then the local council would take up the recovery.
Well, I think that's what we would expect, yes. However, there was no mention of a fire on the National Risk Register of this nature at all, as far as I'm aware, even in 2016-17, and that has subsequently been changed, and a major residential fire has been added, but that risk wasn't catered for on the National Risk Register. Had it been, I think the lead government department would have been the Home Office, and I don't believe that planning for response had really been done in government. But I also believe that my own department's assumption that the first response must be with the local authority, whether it's a private or a public sector block, was correct. And all the history we had was that local authorities were pretty good at this, actually. They knew how to deal with temporary crises. They had resilience arrangements with other boroughs, particularly in London, that they could draw on. And so although the circumstances of Grenfell Tower were very exceptional, I think we were right to assume that the council would step forward into the temporary rehousing effort rather better than it actually did.
And let's then turn to the events themselves, and we start on the 14th of June. And can we start with a CLG 402877? And if we look together at the email at the foot of the page, timed at 9:07 in the morning of that day, it comes from your office to Nicholas Holgate, copied to Joe Farrer, subject fire incident. And you say, "Hi, dear Nick, I just wanted to express how shocked and sad I was to hear about the terrible fire at Grenfell Tower this morning. We are ready to help however we can from central government. Joe Farrer from DCLG is already leading on this. Obviously today you'll be dealing with the immediate response, but do let us know, as and when it's helpful, if there is anything we can do." Would it be correct to say that this email suggests that you didn't think that RBKC would require assistance from DCLG in the immediate response, at least that day?
I think my email is pretty open in offering support as and when it is helpful, if there is anything we can do. Obviously, the last thing you would want to do, particularly only a few hours after a crisis like this has first started, is to get in the way from central government. But I think this is a pretty open-ended offer.
Did you think at the time that assistance from the department would be required immediately, either in the response phase or very early in stages in the recovery phase?
Well, I don't think I really knew at that point. It was clear within a matter of hours, certainly by mid-afternoon, that they were going to need some help with the longer-term rehousing challenge. And we swept in to support them on that, actually on Wednesday evening and certainly on Thursday, both from the department and through the Homes and Communities Agency. But more widely, I don't think I knew at that point. And this is, 9 o'clock in the morning. My priority was just to reach out to the council and make sure that they knew we were there and to make an offer of support and to make contact.
What was it about the incident that you knew at 9:07 that morning that prompted you to offer central government's assistance?
Well, I was aware of course, that, the Bellwyn scheme, the support for families and individuals that were subsequently provided, the sums of money that were paid out through government support. Those were two very specific things that must have been in my mind at the time. I don't recall sitting and writing a list or itemising it or anything like that, but I knew that central government support was likely to be needed, particularly financial support.
Yes, the question I had was really one of impression. What impression had you gained from what you knew at the time, which prompted you to offer central government help, as opposed to thinking that it's the council's responsibility and they can cope without central government assistance?
Well, simply the tower itself and the scale of the fire and the damage, that was clearly going to be an enormous amount of work and require, as it has done, a huge amount of financial commitment to support. And just the scale of that made this obviously an enormous incident where it was unlikely that anyone was going to be able to cope on its own. I mean, at the time, I don't think, particularly thinking about the humanitarian support for families, which I would have seen as very much for the council to lead. So I was more, I suspect, but to be honest, I'm really now inferring something about what I was thinking 5 years ago, and I don't want to go too far in that, or I may mislead you. But I don't think I really thought about the fact that they would need help. It just seemed so obvious that they would, given the scale of what had happened.
I have to say that I read this was your first contact with Mr. Holgate, wasn't it?
Yes, it was.
Yeah, I read it as being a not entirely unconventional expression of support.
So you.
Well, I mean, I would if you're going to make contact with him, your department's responsible for local government.
Yeah.
I don't find it surprising that you should make contact in these terms, offering support without anything specific, just as a measure of solidarity.
Just to show that I was there, really, that we were there. And I knew Nick Holgate a little bit. We had worked together in the Treasury some years before. I didn't know him very well. I didn't have his phone number. But just as a matter of human connection, that was partly what I was trying to do. And I mean, my second paragraph starts, we are ready to help however we can from central government.
Yes. And then you go on to say, Jo Farrer from DCLG is already leading on this. What was she leading on at that point?
So she, as our Director General for Local Government and also as the overall Director General on RED, I knew Jo would be involved in thinking about the local aspects of this and what was going on in North Kensington, particularly not the housing issues. I mean, this is still very early in the day for us to have really worked out what we were dealing with, to be honest. And so later, Helen McNamara, later in the day, in fact, was very clearly leading on the rehousing issues with the council. But I would have expected, and indeed my conversation with Jo earlier in the day had, I think, created an agreement amongst us that she was leading on the wider issues around the local response.
Earlier in the day. Do you remember when?
I believe it was at around 7 or 7:30 in the morning that I contacted Joe. It's in my first witness statement, I believe.
Right, let's see if I think we can probably short-circuit that question. Can we go to CLG 3030414, please, page 5? What I'm showing you, Dame Melanie, is Dr. Farrer's witness statement at paragraph 20, and she says, I spoke by phone to Melanie Dawes at around 7:45 a.m. on my way into the department. We discussed the fire, RED's response and involvement, MHCLG's role in supporting a locally led recovery effort, and MHCLG's responsibilities in relation to housing and building safety. Given the location of Grenfell Tower, it was obvious that RBKC would have a key role in the relief effort. Melanie Dawes indicated she knew Nicholas Holgate during her time at HM Treasury and would contact him to offer government's support. Does Dr. Farrer's recollection of that telephone conversation accord with yours?
Yes.
And as you've told us just now, as she says in the last sentence, you knew Nicholas Holgate from HM Treasury, your time there.
Yes, I didn't know him very well, but we had worked alongside each other for a number of years, and I had seen him once or twice since I arrived at the department because of his role at RBKC, but I hadn't visited the council or particularly got to know them.
Can we then go back to the email chain, please, at CLG 402877? We can see Nicholas Holgate's response to you, the next email up on page 1 at 9:09. Many thanks, plenty of blue light resource at present. Do you remember what your reaction to that was?
I was a bit surprised. I didn't really think it was an answer to my email, to be honest. The fact that there's plenty of blue light resource didn't really seem to me to be especially relevant, to be honest, to what I thought I was offering in my previous email, which was a much more general support for the council, as opposed to the blue light resource, which was clearly part of the immediate response, but was in some ways rather distinct from what the council were going to need to do. So I was a little bit surprised. I then went into a whole morning of meetings and didn't give it much further thought until later in the afternoon.
Now, let's see, just moving forward into the day a little bit more, if you can help us with a date. Can we go, please, to your first witness statement, page 9, paragraph 23. You describe communication there with the council, and this is under the broader heading, I think, of the 14th of June. If you go to, I can tell you, take it from me without scrolling up, but this part of the statement deals with events on the 14th of June. And if you go 5 lines down from the start of the paragraph, you can see you say, Joe Farrer spoke to him, that's Nicholas Holgate.
Yes.
At 12:30.
Yes, she actually spoke to him at 12:30 on the 15th of June, which I clarified in my second witness statement.
Exactly. Fine. So that's clear.
Yes.
Now, nonetheless, let's just read on to the end of paragraph 23. You say, as confirmed by email, their initial view based on RBKC's strong track record of service delivery and their relatively healthy financial position was that there were no risks to flag. We thought that RBKC's partnership arrangements with Westminster Council and the general strength of cross-borough working in London, as had been recently demonstrated during the Westminster Bridge and London Bridge terror attacks, would further enable them to cope with a disaster on this scale. Did you in fact have a conversation with Joe Farrer on the 14th of June regarding the council's ability to manage, as you set out here, or did that conversation take place and only take place on the 15th of June?
I can't recall, and my apologies that I got the date wrong when I was writing my first witness statement. So I did place these events on the 14th of June. The email that would help me to clarify that is the one that came from the local government risk teams in response to Joe's request, which, and whether that was on Wednesday or Thursday, my recollection is it might have been Thursday. But so that would tie some of these conversations to Thursday rather than Wednesday. But I spoke to Joe a number of times during the Wednesday, and so I'm pretty certain we will have spoken about the council before the end of that first day once again, and not just first thing in the morning.
Just building up a little further then, were you aware that Joe Farrer had sought information from her oversight and risk teams about whether there were any general concerns about RBKC?
Yes, I was, and I think she and I discussed it before she did it. And it's probably helpful just to clarify what those teams were and what the information was that they were giving us. When I arrived in the department in 2015, the Audit Commission had just been abolished, and I was very concerned that I didn't have any oversight function that allowed me to discharge my responsibilities as accounting officer, particularly for the overall financial health of the local government system, with £45 billion a year of money going through the department's own accounts. And so I set up a very small but quite focused team of about 10 or 15 people, and they held an overview with support from the Local Government Association of all councils on 3 dimensions: finance, leadership and service delivery. The service delivery element was pretty much entirely focused on children's social care and adult social care. In other words, services for vulnerable people, not wider services, and certainly not resilience planning. So in seeking information for those teams, from those teams, what Joe and I were doing was, and I believe I was involved in this before she did it, was asking, is there a red flag? We weren't asking, can you give them a clean bill of health? We were just asking, is there anything we need to know about? And the answer was no. Kensington and Chelsea was one of the richest councils in the country, so finance was not an issue. There were no questions around their service delivery that we were aware of, and indeed the tri-borough arrangements were generally perceived to be pretty strong and helping them in that respect, and we weren't aware of any issues around the leadership.
Let's go to CLG 402954. And the middle email on the page is at 1405 from Alex Powell to Joe Farrer, which you get if you go to the top of the screen by way of passing on at 1420 that day. You can see you receive what comes below. Let's go back down to the foot of the page and see how the email chain starts. It comes from Joe Farrer's office to Alex Powell and Emily Bliss at 13:43 on the 14th of June. Alex, Emily, Joe, and that's Joe Farrer. Joe would like a little more information on our relationship with Kensington and Chelsea. Are they on your radar for any reason, and if so, why? Or is there any other information it would be useful to her to note? Thank you for your help this morning with the phone number. And then Alex Powell back on at 1405. Abigail, K&C aren't on our radar at all, and therefore we don't hold anything on them. The Ministerial Support Unit have an app stroke database on councils which can provide general info, facts and figures on funding, housing, TF, etc. if that's of use. The most recent development of note that I'm aware of is the breakdown of the tri-borough agreement, but I suspect Joe is already cited on that. And that comes to you. Now, would you agree that the email from Alex Powell, who was the DD in local government stewardship, as you can see, he is the way he describes himself, that there is no explicit statement that there are concerns or risks about RBKC?
That's right.
Yes.
He's saying they're not on our radar.
Yeah, and indeed nothing in this email that tells you anything of the kind that you've set out in paragraph 23, which I think you attribute to this message. So it looks as if the conversation that you'd had, as you say, was the next day, or is that wrong? Was there a conversation about the matters at 7:45 that morning?
I'm sure there was a conversation with Joe, between me and Joe, on the Wednesday, and what I put in my witness statement is a full summary of what Joe and I believed about the council and its overall capability on the basis of the information that we had, which, as I said, was narrow in some respects because it was designed for a specific purpose. But I think I was aware of this exchange on the Wednesday. I'd be very surprised if I wasn't. So although I got the date wrong about Joe's call with Nicholas Holgate, which was on Thursday, not Wednesday, to the best of my recollection, the other comments in that paragraph, I think, probably took place on Wednesday, having seen the date of this email, which was on the Wednesday.
Right, thank you. Now, so the information at paragraph 23 of your statement is something you think you got from Joe Farrer during that early morning conversation?
No, I think
Or later in the morning?
Could I just see what was in my witness statement again, and then I might be able to help you?
Yes, of course. Can we get back to your first statement, please? Paragraph 23, page 9.
I mean, I say she subsequently sought information from her local government oversight and risk teams. So I think it's probable, but I honestly can't remember in detail, that she and I discussed it in our early morning conversation at 7:45. Right. And that then she sought information, and I think I am correct in my recollection that I knew she was going to seek that information, and there were no concerns flagged. And we also thought that the partnership arrangements gave them extra resilience, and although the tri-borough arrangement had broken down because Hammersmith and Fulham had pulled out, they still had that partnership arrangement with Westminster Council. We thought that would give them extra resilience. But I think it's important for me to say that this wasn't, what we didn't do after this was go, oh, everything's fine. We were simply saying that there was no risk, particularly to flag on the Wednesday, that this council would not be able to cope.
Now, about the same time, your office did receive another email, I think, providing basic background on the leader and the chief executive. And if we go to that, please, that's at CLG. CLG 402952. And it's an email that comes to Alok Sharma's office from your office, I think, at 1419. So it's about the same time as the emails that are being sent up to you from the Powell Bliss team, as it were, Joe Farrer's team. And it's copied to Helen McNamara. Subject, background on Kensington and Chelsea Council. Hi, Danella. This is some really basic background about Kensington and Chelsea and the department's relationship with them. Chris Krasnowski can provide further background if needed. Info on Kensington and Chelsea, fact sheet attached. Leader, and there he is, Nicholas Paget-Brown. His relationship with the department is good. He is well respected and open to discussing various ideas. The general view of officials is that he is a safe pair of hands who runs a tight and steady ship. He's been in post since 2013, was part of the tri-borough system with Hammersmith and Fulham and Westminster. This will officially end in 2018. DCLG Secretary of State has spoken to him today. There's been no readout of this call, and the Minister for London is also trying to speak to him prior to the meeting later this afternoon. And then underneath that, Chief Executive Nicholas Holgate, and there he is. Melanie has emailed and Joe has text today. He had confirmed that he have received, or perhaps they have received, lots of blue light support. And then over the page to the top of page 2, previously worked in HMT, the department has a very good relationship with him. Now, neither of those emails mention anything about the council's civil emergency capabilities, let alone capabilities to respond to the Grenfell Tower fire, do they?
No, they don't.
No.
And we had no role in assuring those capabilities at the time, even through RED.
Did you have any concerns by this point in the early afternoon of the 14th of June about the ability of any council in the country to respond to a disaster such as the Grenfell Tower fire?
I don't recall having any concerns about this particular council at that time. Can I just be reminded of when this email was sent?
Yes, it was sent at 14... Yeah, it was sent at, if we go to the top of the screen, we can see it. It's probably the easiest thing for me to do. 14:19 and 49 seconds.
Yes, I mean,
literally.
It may help just to say that I was not in the department at this point. During the morning and through the lunch period until about 3 o'clock, I was... there's a number of meetings in the department which particularly at the time were focused on building safety. I was particularly concerned about that. And then I had to go to the weekly meeting of permanent secretaries at the Cabinet Office. I then came back to the department, and then I went out to a meeting which lasted for a couple of hours and came back in at 3 o'clock. So this conversation will have been going on before I came back, and it was really in the mid-afternoon that I began to pick up the threads of what was going on, and I had meetings with some of my colleagues. I'm sure I will have spoken to Joe again at that point. I certainly spoke to Helen McNamara, and that was when we really began to, when I began to get a sense of what was going on and what the issues were aside from the building safety ones.
Now, I mean, given the limitations of the information in the emails that you had so far, both the no red flags email that had come to you, making all allowances for where you were on the day, and the information, so far as it is information, in this email, considering the limitations of that information, why did you think that RBKC would be able, as you say in paragraph 23 of your statement, to cope with a disaster of this scale?
Well, I think for the reasons I set out in my witness statement, that there were no flags. They had resilience from the tri-borough arrangements, albeit that those had been scaled back, and the wider London resilience. And that's actually extremely important, that we had seen that in action on the terror attacks over the summer, and knew it to be strong, and knew that experience in London to be very strong, and we knew the cross-borough working relationships to be effective. So all of those things gave us some confidence that the council, with help from others, would be able to cope with this. And to this day, I'm very surprised at the scale of their failure to cope, to be honest. And you know, this is despite the fact that Nicholas Holgate and others I know are people who would always have tried to do everything they could in a situation like this, but their response was not adequate, and I remain surprised by that, and particularly surprised that the London Gold arrangements weren't put in more comprehensively right at the very beginning.
Can we just then go back to paragraph 23 of your statement on page 9? And you say there that the partnership arrangements with Westminster Council and the general strength of cross-borough working in London would further enable them to cope with a disaster on this scale. Was it your view that RBKC would be able to cope with a disaster on this scale without those partnership arrangements and cross-borough working, or only with them?
The latter, only with them. Can I just add that, of course, this early assessment on the Wednesday turned out to be incorrect. You know, we know that now, that they didn't cope. So what I'm not saying here is that what's in paragraph 23, you know, by the time we got to Thursday was still our view. It wasn't. We realised overnight, coming into Thursday morning, and particularly by Thursday afternoon, that there were very serious concerns, and took steps to address those on Friday morning. This was simply stating to you, honestly, what our view was on Wednesday afternoon about whether or not the council, with support from others, would be able to manage this. And there were no flags that suggested they couldn't.
Well, no flags
at that point.
No flags that would suggest they couldn't manage it alone, or no flags that would suggest they couldn't manage it with cross-borough working?
The last sentence of paragraph 23 is extremely important. That was a very important part of our thinking.
Right. So was it your view at the time that, notwithstanding the absence of any flags, RBKC would not be able to cope with a disaster on this scale without cross? I don't think any council could have coped with a disaster on this scale on their own, and that's what the local resilience arrangements are designed to provide, is layers of support and resilience that can be activated to provide support. Now, you told us, as indeed Dr. Farrer told us yesterday, that you knew Nicholas Holgate from your time at the Treasury, and you've said this morning, not well, but you knew him. Is it the case that you were more inclined to give him the benefit of the doubt, or perhaps be more generous towards his management of the response than otherwise might be the case had you not known him?
No, I don't believe that's the case at all.
Mr. Chairman, is that a convenient moment?
Yes. All right. Thank you. Well, as you know, Dame Melanie, we have a break during the morning, and this is a good time to take it. So we'll stop there. We'll resume, please, at 25 to 12. And you know this only too well, but I have to ask you, please, not to talk to anyone about your evidence while you're out of the room. All right?
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Would you go with the usher, please? Thank you very much, Mr. Millett. 25 to 12, please. Would you ask Dame Melanie to come back in, please? All right, Dame Melanie, ready to carry on, I hope.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Mr. Millett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to ask you about the housing arrangements within the DCLG. And it's right, I think, that Sally Randall at the time of the fire was the Director for Housing Standards and Support.
Yes.
Yes. And I think she was made responsible, and tell me if this is wrong, for the initial programme of building safety checks from the afternoon of the 14th of June.
Yes, I believe so. That was a decision made by Helen McNamara, I believe, but I think that's correct.
Yes, and she, I think, as Director for Housing Standards and Support, answered to, reported to Helen McNamara.
Yes, she did.
Yes. Now, if we go, please, to CLG 402883, you can see here is an email from Sally Randall to Housing Standards and Support. It looks like a team email address, subject Grenfell Tower, timed at 10:33. So this is earlier in the day. And she says this: following the terrible fire at Grenfell Tower this morning, teams across the department are involved in putting together briefing for our ministers and supporting the Resilience and Emergency Division on their response. Inevitably, there's a little bit of chaos and hyperactivity in the department this morning, and some potential for duplication and confusion. To try to minimise that, could I ask that if anyone asks you for any briefing or information, that you route through Jane Everton, who will hold the main contact within RED. Read. Thanks for all of your support already this morning. Now, would you agree with the description of the department at that time, that there was a little bit of chaos and hyperactivity in the department?
No, not particularly. There was a lot going on, and we had a lot that we needed to do and did in the subsequent days to put a structure around how everyone was communicating. But no, I don't think it was chaotic or hyperactive.
Now, Fiona Darby was the Deputy Director within Sally Randall's division, wasn't she?
Yes, she was. She was one of the Deputy Directors, yes.
Yeah, she reported to
On
Sally
homelessness, yeah.
I'm sorry. Yes, and she reported to Sally Randall, and she was responsible for homelessness, I think, wasn't she?
Yes, she was.
Now, let's go to RBK 30489990. Yes, this is an email from Fiona Darby to Laura Johnson within RBKC, timed at 11:22 on the 14th of June. Hi, Laura. DCLG are briefing ministers on this, and I've been asked to contact you to understand what has been done already by K&C and what support you potentially need from government. Could I call you, please? Do you know if the department received any response to that message?
No, I was unaware of this email, and I don't know if there was any response.
Now, your offer of assistance to Nicholas Holgate that we saw earlier together at 9:07 that morning, 14th of June, is this right? Was the first offer of assistance from the department to the council?
I don't know if there was any offer via RED in the SCG earlier in the morning, but subject to that, then yes, I think my email was the first.
Right.
Email that went across.
And subject to that, was this the second offer of assistance from central government, your department, to RBKC?
I don't know if there were any other communications.
Then
I believe that Joe Farrer tried to text Nicholas Holgate after my email exchange with him and prior to her conversation on the Thursday, but I'm not aware of any other direct offers of help, particularly at this early stage.
Then let's go to CLG 3030466. This is an email. Yes, if we go to the top email, this is an email from Fiona Darby to Jane Everton at 12:16 p.m. on the 14th of June. Grenfell Tower fire, cross-government meeting today. and she says, I haven't been able to get through to anyone at K&C and so have no information currently as to actual progress by K&C. I'm still trying. Were you aware by this point in the day, just before lunchtime on the 14th, that there was a problem in establishing communication with RBKC?
No, I wasn't aware of that.
Now, just while we're on this email, we can see that she goes on to say, in terms of rehousing, it's just above that. In terms of rehousing, media reports say that an emergency rest centre has been set up for those that were not able to stay with family or friends. Assuming it is a council housing block, which it appears to be from the media reports, then I would anticipate that the households will be moved from the emergency rest centre into hotels or emergency accommodation, whilst the council looks to longer-term solutions. Was it appropriate that the department was relying on media reports for its information on what the local authority was doing in the response?
Well, I think it's entirely appropriate that Fiona was giving whatever information she had, and that included what was in media reports. But, I mean, I hadn't seen this email before, but she's saying in the first sentence that she hasn't been able to get through to anyone, and so she has no information currently as to actual progress. And that's, clearly the context for her then giving the information that she did have.
Yes, I mean, my question is perhaps better put. Did the fact that there were problems getting through to K&C, necessitating reliance by the department on media reports, hamper the ability of the department to obtain reliable and up-to-date information? Was that your recollection at the time?
Well, my recollection is that on Wednesday, Thursday, and even into the weekend, actually, the lack of information about how those who had survived the fire were being offered accommodation, where they had gone, how many there were, that information was extremely hard to find. The council didn't have it themselves. It was one of the major problems, I think, for the gold recovery effort once it started, that data collection, that mapping, that listing of who had been offered what just somehow wasn't functional. And that combined with what I think was rather a defensive approach by the council in not really opening up to others on the Wednesday, made our job very difficult. Yes, it did. And this is one of the early signs of that, I suppose, in this email, although I hadn't seen it before.
I see. Did you detect at this stage that there was or might be a problem with RBKC leading the response in circumstances where, and correct me if this is wrong on the chronology, but it was beginning to appear that the council may be the object of criticism about the cause of the fire?
I don't see anything in this email about the cause of the fire,
No,
but you're asking a more
it's
general question
more
about whether that was becoming a consideration.
Yes.
Well, look, as I was explaining before the break, I was out of the department at this stage, and it was really a bit later in the afternoon that I began to come back and form my own sense of what was going on. So at this stage, I was not aware of any of this. I don't know when it was that connection between the fact that the council owned the block, had refurbished it, had been involved in the causes of the fire in some way, and also the history of complaints and so on. I don't remember when those issues began to become part of the consideration. I just can't remember. I think by the time we got to Thursday, we were definitely aware of that wider context.
At this point, do you remember thinking about or having discussions about deploying somebody either to the town hall to be the department's eyes and ears on the ground receiving information, or to the SCC at Lambeth?
No, I don't recall that. And as I said, I wasn't involved in any of those discussions. I think with hindsight, when I look back on this, I think two things were a gap in our intelligence. One was whether or not London Gold arrangements had been mobilised. Even when they were mobilised on Thursday afternoon, that didn't come in through Red, and I think that was a gap. And something that we could have looked more for, actually, if I'm honest. I think Joe and I perhaps could have sought to find out about London Resilience on the Wednesday or the Thursday. That's my main reflection, actually, really, rather than whether or not we should have visited as the months have gone by. And the other gap, I think, is that there was nobody as part of the Beck arrangements, the Gold arrangements in Kensington and Chelsea, and I think we offered to be a point of liaison, because liaison helps the local responders, because it helps them manage what can sometimes be quite a difficult set of requests from central government, and that, as I understand it, was refused. But I think those two gaps were gaps in process and in aspects of the response that meant that we were over-reliant on what was coming up through the SCG via RED.
Did it occur to you at the time that, notwithstanding the structural gaps, as you've just described, nonetheless you or somebody reporting to you should have got a grip and just gone down there and inserted themselves into the Beck or this SCC at Lambeth, just in order to get it primary information?
Well, by the time it got to Thursday, particularly in the afternoon, when it was clear that things were going wrong, really clear that things were going wrong, I think it began to be clear on Thursday morning, overnight, really, as the information came in, then we were thinking about that. And of course, my own Secretary of State wanted to go on Wednesday and wanted to go again on Thursday and was unable to do so for a number of reasons, mainly because the Prime Minister's visit was being arranged instead for Thursday. And I think had he gone, we would have gone, somebody would have gone with him, probably Joe or Gillian Kay or somebody like that. And we would have got a better feel for what was going on more immediately. But for us to have gone, particularly on the Wednesday, would have been very difficult. You can't just walk into a room like that when there's a command structure in place, or at least one hopes there is, that's effective. You can't just sort of show up from central government and expect to be able to effectively interfere and challenge. So, as I said, I think there are some bits of intelligence that we could have had, some that we would have liked to have had and weren't able to get. And I also think it's quite right that RED's role has been broadened to look for signs of stress now. Their role was quite narrow. It was to report what information there was on the ground, and they did that. And I think they discharged their duties correctly, but I think the role now needs to be slightly wider, and I think we've learnt from that through this experience. And I'm just sorry we had to learn it through this, frankly.
If you go back to the email, please, and look at the paragraph 4 lines up from the bottom, where Fiona Darby says, in any event, can you see that?
Yes.
She says, in any event, the CE of K&C is likely to make contact with fellow CEs, as chief executives, across London, as they have emergency pan-London protocols and agreements to support each other in these circumstances, and might ask homelessness teams across London to assist with TA, that's temporary accommodation, I think. The sub-region is very close-knit, and it could be that the sub-region, rather than pan-London, might be asked to assist with emergency accommodation. Now, you referred earlier to the Tri-Borough Agreement and the partnership with Westminster Council. We looked at that. And here we see reference to the pan-London and sub-region being involved in the response. Was it your expectation at that point that pan-London and sub-regional arrangements would kick in, or had already kicked in?
Yes, I don't recall explicitly asking myself the question, have they kicked in? As I said earlier, as Permanent Secretary, I was looking across the whole range of the issues that the department was dealing with, including building safety. And so I did not specifically ask myself that question, but had I done, I would have assumed that they would have kicked in, and I wouldn't have assumed that central government needed to make that happen, or really to check, to be honest. Fiona Darby had joined us from a London borough, and so her description in that final 2 sentences is based on her direct experience of working in local government in London, and as such, I think she's absolutely correct in what she would have assumed, having worked in local government, as well as what we were assuming from central government.
Right, so from your recollection at the time, does this email, although you didn't receive it, tell us that the department's expectation is that Nicholas Holgate would be likely to make contact and ask for pan-London or mutual aid or pan-London arrangements in dealing with a potential homelessness problem?
Yes. this is Fiona's view. She's expressing it, but it would have been a shared view across the department, and Fiona's direct experience would have been quite authoritative in saying what she thought would have happened.
And did you have any reason at this point to think that Nicholas Holgate not only had not done that, but was not going to do that, but to try to manage matters himself?
No, I had no inkling of that at this stage.
Now, let's turn to the Secretary of State. We looked at an email where we saw that the leader and chief executive's details were provided to your office, and a reference was made there, as you can see, to the fact that the Secretary of State had spoken with the leader of the council, Councillor Nicholas Paget-Brown. You saw that. Were you made aware of what was discussed between them?
If there was a record of it, then I think I will have seen it. And I do recall some conversations. I recall the Secretary of State's conversation with the Mayor of London. I don't specifically recall this one with Nick Paget-Brown.
Do you remember whether the Minister reinforced your message from just after 9 o'clock that morning that the department stood ready to provide assistance?
I can't immediately recall that without seeing the note of that discussion, but I would have expected the Secretary of State to offer assistance. We were very much in that mode. We were already starting to mobilise on permanent rehousing issues, certainly by the afternoon of Wednesday.
Right. Was it your understanding that the Secretary of State had offered assistance specifically in relation to housing?
Well, I'm flying blind a bit here because I'm not. I don't know if there's a record of the meeting, but what I recall is, or that rather not of the meeting, of the conversation. What I recall is that the council, via Nick Paget-Brown, did say that they were going to need help with the permanent rehousing. I believe they also said they needed help with communications. I can't remember whether that was just whether that was Wednesday or whether it came later, but it did definitely come later. And I think that request on the permanent rehousing came quite early because we responded to it actually, and were on those issues pretty early on, the permanent rehousing issues on Wednesday afternoon and on Thursday.
Well, let me just show you Sajid Javid's first witness statement, please. This is at CLG 1000978. And I just want to show you page 10, paragraph 39. And he says, by 1419 and following the 1215 briefing, I'd spoken to Councillor Nicholas Paget-Brown. We discussed what support MHCLG could offer the council. We were ready to offer anything that the council requested, such as help with money or personnel to book emergency accommodation, i.e. hotels. I was clear throughout the first 7 days that I didn't want money to become an issue, and that day requested and received briefing on Belwyn funding. Then he goes on at 40, there was no request for help with emergency accommodation, i.e. rest centres and hotels. Now, did you know that? Did you know that the council had not asked for help with emergency accommodation?
No, but those two paragraphs are consistent with what I just said, I think, and my understanding of what is likely to have been said between Nicholas Paget-Brown and Sajid Javid. And in addition, I do recall that they asked for help on the permanent rehousing, and I think that happened on the Wednesday. Perhaps it was the conversation with Alok Sharma later in the day, I don't know, but I don't think it was long before they were asking us for help on the permanent rehousing as well. But I don't recall any request for help on the emergency accommodation either in those early few hours and days, so this is consistent with my recollection.
Then let's move to what was happening in or from number 10 at this point, which is halfway through, or lunchtime-ish on the 14th of June. Can we go, please, to CLG 402946? We go to page 1 of this email run. Bottom of the page. This is an email from Lorna Grattan, who was the Prime Minister's private secretary at the time, and this is an email timed at 13:54 to Louise Morgan, copy to Alistair Whitehead. Louise, we spoke about the incident at Grenfell Tower. You kindly agreed to get us what you can on, and then there's a list of bullet points starting with building regulations at the foot of the screen, and then over the page, please. If you look at the second set of 3 bullet points, rehousing efforts. I understand that some of this will already have been dealt with by CCS. If that is the case, please do feel free to reuse what was produced for that. How is the Council coping with rehousing requirement? Does it need additional support from us? If so, what kind of support are we able to offer? And if we go to the top of that email chain, back to page 1, please, we can see that this email comes into your office at 14:04, so 10 minutes later or so, directly to Bob Leadsom and Richard Harrell for reasons to do with the other bullet points I haven't shown you, but copied to Helen McNamara and others, and also to the offices of Alok Sharma, who was the Minister of State, and the Secretary of State, Office of Sajid Javid. Afternoon, thanks for all your hard work on this. To complement the questions from Sheridan at number 10, which I know you're working on, there are some questions from Lorna on the official side. I'd be grateful for answers as soon as you possibly can, and if necessary, we can send over in parts. Were you made aware at the time yourself that number 10 was asking these questions, particularly about rehousing efforts?
I don't recall seeing the specific email at the time, but by the time I came back to the department later in the afternoon, yes, I think I will have been made aware that number 10 were asking questions. If I might add, I think this also shows a certain amount of duplication that was going on in the conversations across government, because here you have number 10 on the political and the official side asking questions of the department and of the Secretary of State's office, while in parallel a COBRA meeting is being called that doesn't involve the principals from number 10 or anybody at cabinet level, including the Secretary of State. So that's one of the reasons why I think it would have helped to have had one meeting that involved cabinet ministers on the Monday. I think it would have helped communication and made things a bit easier for everybody to handle.
You say on the Monday, do you mean the Wednesday?
Sorry, I meant the Wednesday. It's because it was the beginning.
Yes.
That's why my brain went to Monday.
No, I understand. Now, do you remember what action, if any, you or the department took once you'd come back to the department later that afternoon in response, if any response, to number 10's questions about rehousing?
I don't remember anything specifically in response to those questions, no. Just a general sense of coming back and meeting with Helen McNamara and Sally Randall to think about all of the issues on the housing side of the department, which included building safety, but also the issues in North Kensington.
Now, you mentioned the ministers' meeting. It's right, I think, that, and this is a matter of record, but just to get your confirmation of it, that the Cabinet Office, through the CCS, arranged a ministerial meeting, a cross-government ministerial meeting at 1600 hours that afternoon, 14th of June, yes?
Yes.
Yeah. Now, you didn't attend that meeting, did you?
No.
I think you had another engagement to go to, yes?
No, I think I was back from that engagement at around 3:30, so I could have gone, but others went instead. It was a meeting at junior minister level, and so, I would never pile in as the permanent secretary and get in the way of my colleagues unless I was needed.
Right. Was there any reason why you didn't clear your diary from the morning, not least because your department was always going to be the lead government department on recovery in respect to this incident?
I did clear my diary. Everything apart from that one meeting over lunchtime on Wednesday was stripped out. I think there may have been one meeting with an external stakeholder on the Friday that remained, but everything else was cleared out. I went ahead with the meeting at lunchtime on Wednesday. It was with all of the newly elected mayors in the combined authorities. It had originally been set up as a ministerial meeting. No ministers were able to attend, and that was partly because of the reshuffle and the general election. And I felt it was essential for me to go. It would have been extremely rude of me not to go. So I went to that meeting, came back, but from that moment on, there was nothing else.
So you came back, so why didn't you go to the 4 o'clock meeting?
Well, as is quite normal, those who are closest to the work would attend in support of ministers. So I can't remember exactly who went from the department. Did Helen McNamara go, or was it Catherine Richardson, I think, definitely went to represent Red in particular, and I believe somebody else went to Perhaps it was Steve Quartermain because of the building regulations issues, which he was at the time still responsible for. So I'm not sure, but my guess is that it was decided while I was out who would go, but I don't think there was any question that I would go as permanent secretary.
Right. Now, we know the Housing Minister did attend.
Yes,
And
the local government minister.
Yes, that's Alex Sharma. Did he feed the relevant points back to you? Did he brief you afterwards?
No, he didn't brief me afterwards, but I was informed of the meeting. I will have seen the actions at some point later that evening when they came round. I was in the office until about 11 p.m, so I had many conversations through that evening about what was going on, and I caught up on emails as they came in.
Right. Now, if we go to your first witness statement, please, at page 10, paragraph 27 on that page, at the foot of the screen, it says this: the cross-government ministerial meeting agreed the following actions for the department: to liaise with RBKC regarding the urgent provision of temporary accommodation for those displaced from Grenfell Tower, although it was clarified in the minutes that RBKC was not seeking additional assistance at this time, and to discuss with the National Fire Chiefs Council and the devolved administrations how best to take forward the identification of at-risk buildings and associated safety advice across the UK. Were you made specifically aware of the need for an urgent provision of temporary accommodation?
I was certainly aware of the need to support the council on the housing effort, and as I said, I think by Wednesday evening we were quite focused on that. And in my first witness statement, I sought to give the inquiry as much information as I could about all of what the department was doing during these days, even when I wasn't involved in it myself. I think this is a good example of me just trying to be helpful by saying what had happened, because it helps the narrative and flow of how I was then explaining what I recalled of those days.
Yes. Did you understand that the urgent provision of temporary accommodation for those displaced was emergency temporary accommodation in the very short term, or the next stage in rehousing people affected by the fire?
Yes, I thought it was both. It was going
Both.
to need to be both.
And how did the department resolve to act on the action taken away from the ministerial meeting of liaising with the council about temporary accommodation?
I can't quite recall exactly what we did that evening, but I mean, I know my colleagues' witness statements will have explained that. But we, over the following days, we in particular embedded support through Lizzie Clifford with the council to help them. But above all, in the end, the goals command structure came in and took over those efforts eventually to put them onto a more sustainable footing.
Now, if we turn the page in your statement, please, to page 11 and go to paragraph 31. You say at the foot of the screen, at 15:30, I met with Helen McNamara and Sally Randall to take stock of the implications of the Grenfell Tower fire for the housing side of the department. At this meeting, it was agreed that dedicated resource would be needed to coordinate activity across the housing and planning group, and Camilla Sheldon was appointed to lead this. Now, this is half an hour before the start of the cross-government ministerial meeting. Was it agreed between you that a dedicated resource would be needed to coordinate activity across the housing and planning group?
Yes.
And did you discuss immediate need for emergency accommodation for those affected by the fire?
Perhaps you could show me the next, the remainder of that paragraph.
Yes, of course. It says we also, and if we turn the page to page 12, discuss the building safety checks, the building regulations, and the need to investigate any potential failures across the system.
Yes, so that's the best of my recollection as to what we discussed at that meeting.
I mean, my question was, did you discuss the immediate emergency accommodation needs of those affected by the fire?
I think we must have done. But whether we discussed the need for the department to take any action in relation to it, I don't know. Probably not. Although I was writing this witness statement, recalling, trying to recall what we had discussed in a meeting, at a very, very busy time when there were a lot of such conversations. So I can't be absolutely clear that we did or didn't discuss the need to
do you remember
support on the temporary accommodation.
No, I understand, but doing the best you can with your recollection, do you remember whether there was an action that you decided to take forward as a result of your discussion at this meeting about immediate emergency accommodation needs?
I don't think I took forward any actions, and throughout this whole period, I was trying to give my own staff as much space as possible to make decisions without constantly having to refer back to me or for me to tell them what those answers were. The thing that we struggled with on Wednesday, and particularly once we got into Thursday and Friday, and the weight of the situation became clearer and the number of actions we were dealing with became clearer, was that we had to set up some kind of coordination mechanism inside the department to manage that. And that was distinct from the coordination and information mechanisms that Red were in charge of in terms of feeding information from the ground. And it was that lack of a DCLG cell, response cell, and a structure around that with shift patterns and information flows and timings of meetings, that held us back. And I mentioned that in my first witness statement as one of the things that was difficult in those early days. And we eventually sorted it, first with a significant improvement when Lisanne Boissière came in on Friday to sort it out. But in the end, we needed support from CCS, which is why I was so keen to get someone seconded. And eventually we had Ian Whitehouse join us in the following week. So that's very much an internal departmental resourcing issue. But what I would have expected us to do, and what we were definitely doing once we get into Thursday, was logging all the actions that were coming from the ministerial group, any other actions that we were dealing with besides, and we were tracking those, we were communicating, and we were trying to not duplicate so that people weren't colliding with each other and doing the same thing. We were trying to be clear about accountability.
Let's then move on to CLG 402995. This is back on the topic of the interactions with RBKC. And here is an email from Joanna Beck at 16:37 to Fiona Darby and Sally Randall, subject Grenfell. Hello, Fiona and Sally. I've managed to get hold of Altin Smargy, who is the Housing Options Manager in K&C. He's not at work today, but has been keeping in touch with colleagues and was about to go into work for the overnight shift. His information was TA need particularly demanding, as 7 to 8 surrounding blocks have been evacuated and cordoned off until found to be safe. They are receiving a lot of offers of support. RPs offering voids for use as TA, other local authorities offering properties for TA, etc. 3 rest centres have been set up for residents, and again a lot of offers of support from all over to help with staffing these. I asked Alton to keep us informed, including if there is any way in which we can support them further. Fiona, are you now doing the 5:30 meeting, or am I? Thanks very much. Joe. Now, my question is a broad one. First, I don't know whether you saw this email at the time or a message like it, but was this an example of the general offers of assistance that DCLG were providing to the council on the afternoon of the 14th of June?
Yes, it looks like a good example of that. I wasn't aware of this at the time.
Right. And what would the department be able to do in practice by way of further support?
When it comes to the temporary accommodation needs, I would have expected the main issue to have been one of finance, which I think we did provide on the temporary accommodation as well as on the permanent accommodation side.
And you can see from the very foot of your screen at the end of the email that Joe Beck is team leader in the Homelessness Reduction Act Delivery Support, Preventing Homelessness team. What was that team's capability in delivering immediate emergency accommodation?
There was no capability for us to provide an immediate emergency accommodation. That's not a function of central government, and it wasn't a function of the department. This was a policy team overseeing a number of very specific projects to tackle homelessness, working in tandem with a number of London boroughs.
I see.
And other boroughs.
Now, then let's look at the Mayor and the Secretary of State's role again. CLG 403011, please. If you go, please, to the email on think we need to go to the foot of the emails chain, please. Go to page... I'm looking... I see what's happened. No, we need CLG 403011, not 4011. Yes, that's it. Thank you. Now, this is an email from the office of Sajid Javid at 1856 on the 14th of June to a wide range of recipients, including your own office and the office of Joe Farah and Alok Sharma and Sajid Javid. So it went right across the department. Subject, readout, SOS call to Sadiq Khan. Hi all, please find a quick readout of the SOS's call with the Mayor of London below. Sadiq Khan dialed into the ministerial meeting chaired by Nick Hurd this afternoon, and he was impressed with the government's response so far. The Mayor flagged 2 key points to the SOS. Rehousing. Both the SOS and the Mayor are very keen to ensure that we are working closely with RBKC to ensure that everyone that has been displaced by this incident is permanently relocated to homes in central London where possible and are definitely not housed outside of London. Camilla, please can you work out what support we can offer RBKC on this? Was anything done, do you know, following that request?
Yes, I'm sure it was. I think that will have been followed up probably mainly on the Thursday, given that it was already approaching 7 o'clock in the evening. But I don't know exactly what was followed up, but that's very consistent with the general conversation at the time of beginning increasingly to worry about supporting the council on rehousing.
Right. Now, there's no need to go to it, but at paragraph 24 of your statement at page 9, I think we saw this. You were made aware that the Minister for Housing and Planning, Alok Sharma, had spoken to Nicholas Paget-Brown on the evening of the 14th of June, and Mr. Paget-Brown had reported progress on rest centres and accommodation and had flagged challenges that the council would face in providing permanent rehousing. That's what you say in paragraph 24. I've summarised it for you, but is that...
I'm sorry, could I see that?
Oh, of course. It's page 9 of your first statement, paragraph 24.
Yes.
And essentially,
yes, and
I've repeated it to you.
No, it's fine. The sentence about providing permanent rehousing, that sentence,
yes,
plus the mention of permanent rehousing by the Mayor in the conversation with the Secretary of State, are both consistent with what I was saying to you earlier, which is that I believe the department was getting pretty focused on the permanent rehousing challenge as early as Wednesday evening. And that's some of the work that we did later through the Homes and Communities Agency to try to find accommodation and so on. So that was, I think, the thing that we were really picking up the baton on once we got to this stage in the response.
So that's a longer term recovery question.
It is, and it's the word permanent is there in both those conversations, and that's my recollection, as I was saying earlier, that was the main focus for us rather than the temporary accommodation. It was the permanent accommodation that was going to be so difficult because fundamentally this is one of the most expensive housing markets in the country, and there just wasn't very much social housing available. So it was going to need a huge effort to try to find accommodation for the families.
Now, just focusing a little bit more on perhaps the first part of that answer, did you regard the emergency need for temporary accommodation as part of the recovery or part of the response?
I don't know. I think I didn't think at the time about that distinction, but my personal view is that the distinction between recovery and response does not help sometimes when you're actually faced with an actual emergency and need to think about the issues that you're facing. So, as I said to you earlier, nobody ever said to us, you are responsible for recovery, please get on with it. We did it anyway. But neither do I think it was clear what the response issues were and what the recovery issues were. The lead government department, the Home Office, didn't really get involved in any of this. And I think that in practice, issues like rehousing are on a continuum, and the recovery needs to start right from the beginning. And in a way, does it matter whether or not temporary accommodation is part of recovery and response? The important thing is that it's dealt with. So I think it was clear that it was for the local responder and the local authority, and I personally think it's clear that they should always be in the lead. Central government can't add a lot to the real emergency response. But I think the Cabinet Office in particular, perhaps with my former department, needs to do some thinking about this, because this difference between response and recovery was not clear, and I think it got in the way a bit.
Yes, and does that tell us that, well, let me ask it differently. At the time, did you think, or ask yourself or anybody else, what is the Home Office, as the lead government department for the response, doing about temporary accommodation, emergency temporary accommodation?
I didn't ask myself that question, but had I answered it, I would have said they weren't doing anything. I wouldn't really have expected them to do anything, to be honest. I would have expected them to look to us to talk to the council about what was going on, and that is what happened. I think it's a very good example of how their role as lead in response wasn't really one that I thought really made sense in the response to Grenfell, to be honest.
And did you think at the time that, notwithstanding that that DCLG was not the lead government department for the response, that nonetheless it should act as if it were, so far as emergency temporary accommodation was concerned?
I think my demeanour and that of my Secretary of State and of all my colleagues was just to lean into whatever needed doing. So we weren't thinking about response or recovery, and the planning hadn't been done on either response or recovery, really, in my opinion. And so there was nothing really for us to be drawing on, and the Home Office weren't really drawing on anything either. So what we did was simply try to manage and to listen, to deal with whatever information we had, and to do whatever we could to help. That was our overall approach and demeanour. But a bit more advanced planning and preparation would have helped us. There's no question in my mind about that.
Yes, and would you agree that that would have, the advanced planning and preparation, the need for that would have been more obvious to each of the government departments if their roles in the response had been more clearly delineated?
Yes, I think for me there are two dimensions to this. One is the dimension of response versus recovery, whereas I think there is a natural assumption that response is what matters in the first few days and recovery kicks in later, which is why I think the recovery planning is not really expected of DCLG or any other department in the same way as it is expected for a lead government department for response, because the recovery issues generally present themselves as the crisis unfolds, and so you have time to pick them up. And I think that's just not really very helpful. I think in practice the recovery thinking needs to be planned for and needs to be thought about explicitly and tasked by the Cabinet Office at the beginning. Now, it may be that at the start you say there isn't going to be a central government role in recovery, and it may be that as the days go by that judgment changes and you have to switch something on, but I believe there should be a more explicit consideration of recovery issues and a lot more preparation further in advance. That's one dimension. I think the other dimension is about the actual issues and the outcomes and the problems we were dealing with. The Home Office was the lead government department just because it was a fire, but the Home Office didn't really have anything to do. And indeed, they didn't really do very much. There were some extremely hard-working officials who came to every meeting. They were the people from fire and police. But it was the emergency services themselves who were doing all the who were answering all the questions in the COBRA meetings and who were really the ones who were feeding into the cross-ministerial discussions. So I think it was just wrong to assume that the Home Office was going to be able to cover off all the response issues in relation to a crisis like this. We should have been much more involved, and perhaps prior to the moving of fire across to the Home Office in 2016, it would have been, the department would have been more joined up, although there was not a fire on the National Risk Register at that point.
Thank you. Now, let's then go to page 12 of your statement. Back to your first statement, please. Paragraph 34, page 12. End of day one, you say you remained in the office until around 2300, and then you say this. I spoke to Sir Jeremy Hayward, Cabinet Secretary and Head of the Civil Service, in the early evening to update him on the situation. I also spoke to Sir Philip Ruttenham, Permanent Secretary at the Home Office. Much of my focus that evening was to ensure that there was a full inquiry into what had happened and why, including how the fire had spread and the links to building regulations. And then you go on there. Did you discuss the building regulations?
With Jeremy Hayward or with
Jeremy
Philip
Hayward?
Ruttenham? Yes, I believe I did. I can't remember exactly what aspect of it, but I think we must have discussed it because it was such a big issue,
Right.
and indeed was a lot of what we were concerned about in thinking that an inquiry was needed.
Right. And did you discuss what then became the building safety programme?
Yes, we didn't know very much at that point, of course, but I will have discussed with Jeremy what I knew, and he, I'm sure, will have asked me a lot of very good questions because that's what he always did.
Can we take it from these discussions late on the evening of the 14th of June that there was real concern within the department about the department's own actions in response to Lacanau?
Yes, there was real concern, and most of us, as you know, certainly me and Helen McNamara and my ministers were new to these issues, had been unaware of them. And as I explained in my previous evidence to the inquiry, and we were grappling with this, trying to make sense of it, trying to gather the information, and we were deeply worried even at this stage. We were to become even more worried as the days unfolded. But that was a lot of what I was worried about this evening, and this particular evening, and the need to have a full investigation of what had happened.
Were your concerns in relation to this topic something that perhaps diluted the attention that the department was giving to the immediate response or the immediate early stages of the recovery in the aftermath of the Grenfell Tower fire?
No, I don't think it's fair to say that it was diluted. I think on that Wednesday evening, we didn't have the information that we had on Thursday morning and throughout that second day on the failure of the local authorities' response. And as I said earlier, I think, there was a question for me as to why those issues weren't aired in the SCG meetings. We were finding out things by talking directly to the council when we were able to that weren't coming up through the SCG. So I think there's something about why that wasn't in the SCG conversation, but it wasn't, and therefore we weren't getting that through the normal red channels. The council wouldn't really engage on that first day. I wish we had checked what London Resilience were up to and what they thought, because I think that would have been a very good conversation on the Wednesday with John Barradell or Eleanor Kelly or others, but we didn't do that. But I don't think it was about the building safety issues dominating.
Right.
I was trying to manage effectively two crises, yes, and so was my Secretary of State, but I did have Joe Farrer on the local issues and Helen McNamara on the housing issues, and the department, I believe, mobilised pretty effectively in response to both of those things.
Did you discuss what was done by Southwark in the immediate aftermath of the Lacanau House fire to see whether any good practices commended themselves to be adopted in the aftermath of this fire?
I don't particularly recall that, no.
No. Let's then turn to the next day, the 15th of June, and let's start at HOM 3044761, bearing in mind the conversation that you'd had in the late evening of the 14th that we've just been through. This is an email from Philip Rutnam to the Home Office Permanent Secretary and others in the Home Department. Update, not for onward distribution, at 7:03 in the morning. And he says, I think I'll leave speaking to Melanie, thanks, I'm off to Manchester. And then in the last paragraph, he says, I'm worried that for the sake of the government as a whole about what will happen if CLG do start taking the lead. On the basis of yesterday, there is a real risk that they will comprehensively mess it up. Both SOS and PermSec seemed frankly to be at the risk of panicking. I know we think more of this issue is likely to shift to CLG in time, given the building standards issue, but I think number 10 should consider the need for a single, calm lead across government. Do you know what might have given Sir Philip Rutnam cause to harbour those concerns he expresses there?
I think it was the conversation I had with him on the Wednesday evening, which was referred to in the excerpt from my witness statement, which you showed me a moment ago. And that conversation was about the public inquiry. And as I've said elsewhere in my statements, we believed that we needed a public inquiry. We believed it needed to be set up as quickly as possible. I had discussed that with Sue Gray at the Cabinet Office. It was part of my conversation with Jeremy Hayward. Philip was of the view that this would not be a good idea, and that's what I think he means by me and my Secretary of State panicking, that we were panicking by believing that a public inquiry was needed.
Were you? Were you at
I
risk
don't
of
think we were panicking, no. And a week or so after the fire, I think everybody was looking at our leadership of this, which I think is what we did alongside the Cabinet Officer number 10, and was actually rather glad that we'd been in charge.
Was it you who came up with the idea of instituting this inquiry?
No, it wasn't me. I think it was Helen McNamara, mostly alongside the Secretary of State. I was fully in support of them, as was Jeremy Hayward and Sue Gray, and the Prime Minister announced it the next morning. But we had sent an email that evening at about 10:30, I believe, via, I think, James Nation in the Secretary of State's office to number 10 on some of the wider questions, and we had intended that email to be agreed with the Home Office, but they had gone by the time we were ready to send it, and we discussed earlier drafts with them. And I think it, although actually it's quite nuanced about the need for an inquiry because we knew their position, I think they were still pretty cross about it because they had quite strong views.
Now, let's then go to a little bit later on the same morning, 15th June, CLG 100097050. And that's CLG 100097050. It's from Sir Jeremy Hayward to you on the 15th of June at 9:12, subject fire. Lots of concern here that the LA is not gripping the aftermath, rehousing, etc. Is that fair? Should CLG second in some people to help? Which of your ministers is now gripping this tightly? Now, if you go to your first statement, please, at page 14, if we can go to that, you can see what you say at paragraph 41 about this email. And you say that you replied to him at the end of the day with an update. And I also made sure you say that Jo Farrow was aware of his email before her visit to Kensington and Chelsea the following day. Is that right?
Yes.
Why did you wait until the end of the day, 15th of June, to respond to Sir Jeremy?
Well, there was a lot going on that day, and I had a good working relationship with Jeremy Hayward, and I knew he didn't need me to go back straight away. What I believe happened is that his concerns were circulated around. I know I saw his email straight away. I would always have seen an email from Jeremy, and if I'd missed it, my office would have brought it to my attention. So his concerns, alongside those of Nick Hurd and others, were definitely part of the thinking and the gathering concern that was beginning on Thursday. And then when the Prime Minister visited, I think those were even more acutely felt and seen and heard, because we were actually on the ground with quite large numbers of people from central government that afternoon.
When you received his email, did you share his concerns? Did you recognise them, or did they come as a surprise to you?
This was quite early for us to be hearing those concerns. And so I think his email was probably one of the first that I saw that began to express those concerns.
Did you?
Sorry, yes, that's fine. I'll finish there.
Why didn't you go back to him either immediately or shortly afterwards and ask him what he meant and what the problem was?
Well, I thought the most important thing was to hear the concerns and to take them into the thinking. And we had a meeting with the Secretary of State at 9:30, and that didn't conclude actions more broadly on the response, but it did include getting confirmation on the housing situation in particular, which was one of the concerns that Jeremy had raised. Essentially, what I think I did was to take Jeremy's concerns into that meeting and into subsequent meetings inside the department as one of several bits of information that we were getting that there was a problem. And then the cross-ministerial meeting later that afternoon was the place where that really crystallised.
Yes, but my question is a bit more prior to that. I mean, why didn't you get onto him by email in response and say, what do you mean? What exactly is the problem?
Well, I don't think I needed to. I think he was being quite clear, actually, that there were problems with rehousing, and we were hearing that from others as well. So, I don't know really. I had an immediate meeting to go to, but I felt the important thing was to pick up the worries and to try to deal with them and to try to validate the information. As I say, it was one amongst several emails and bits of intelligence that were coming in, because some ministers had been on the ground as well.
Yes. Well, let's look at exactly that. This may be another example, or an example. HOM 30 46090. If we go, please, to the foot of the page, here is an email from the Fire Minister's Private Secretary to Sajid Javid's office. James, thanks so much for your time on the phone. Sorry, it was at 8:45 that morning, I should point out to you, 15th of June. As promised, here are the points we covered. And then the first bullet point. If number 10 would like the parliamentary session to be a joint HO-DCLG event, then we're planning for it to be at 13:30, etc. The second bullet point, the Minister has been told there is an urgent, underlined, issue with access to cash for former residents of Grenfell Tower. He's also been told via Margot James MP, BEIS Minister, that the Post Office, there's a local one around the corner from the Tower, have offered to facilitate access to money for residents. He'd be really grateful if your teams were able to facilitate a link between the Post Office and the local council so that they can make people aware. And then this, third bullet point. There have also been a couple of concerns raised with him about the quality of the sleeping materials that were available for people last night, and asked if there was anything HMG could do to help the council upgrade. And now, were you made aware of any of these concerns being relayed by Nicholas Hurd's office on that morning?
I was aware that Nicholas Hurd had had some concerns when he'd visited. I can't remember when I became aware of that. It's possible that it was at the 9:30 meeting with the Secretary of State, because every time the Secretary of State picked up anything of concern, he was on it straight away and asking us to investigate it.
Right.
I wouldn't have felt I needed to investigate it myself, but I was certainly confident that those dynamics were working through the department. And then the other time I might have been made aware of this was at 1:30 when I chaired a stock take across the department to try to pull together all the different issues we were grappling with, and where I was describing earlier, it was the first such stock take meeting, really. And there again, I suspect some of these questions were raised. I can't remember exactly what we did in response or who followed it up, but when a minister raises something like this, civil servants will act on it.
Then let's go to CAB 405941. This is at 9:15 on the same morning. So half an hour afterwards, here comes an email from Alistair Whitehead to Lorna Grattan internally. And the second email down says, can you get a debrief from Peter on what needs to happen today? It's Peter Hill, I think. In short, seems to be a mess in terms of rehousing and coordination for the families affected, and we need to send DCLG teams down there to help. Were you aware that number 10 had concerns about the response on the ground that morning?
I was aware on the basis of the email from Jeremy Hayward, and I was aware of the conversation between the Prime Minister and the Secretary of State. I mean, when Alistair Whitehead says, in short, seems to be a mess in terms of rehousing and coordination, that seems to be, with what I know now, to be accurate.
Did you know it at the time?
No, I think that is put more strongly than we knew at the time. And we didn't see that email, at least I didn't see it. But I think, look, honestly, I think it took us, quite a long time on Thursday to realise the scale of that problem. We were relying on the information that was coming up through the SCG, where these issues weren't being raised. The council didn't want us coming to their meetings. We offered to have somebody in those meetings, and that offer was refused, as I understand it. And, that's the day when I think, in an ideal world, Joe Farrer or I would have perhaps called London Resilience, actually, if I had to think of one action that I think we could have done on that day that might have made a difference. That's the one, rather than visiting, which would also have been good, but I think would have been very difficult to arrange in practice. Can I say one more thing, which is when you get lots and lots of bits of information like this coming in from lots of different places, it's quite hard to validate them quickly, because you do need to go and find out what's going on. But we had read there, but the information sources read were not really confirming this. And we weren't able to get into the local authority, which is the place where I think we would have seen that there was a problem. That's why I go to London Resilience being the place that I think we could have and should have turned to go, what's going on? You know, this is just so odd. Why is it that the response seems to be going so badly? And then maybe we would have got there a bit earlier in the day on Thursday, rather than on Friday morning. So it's a question of, I don't know, 12 to 15 hours that we might have been able to have just got there a bit sooner, maybe a little bit longer, but probably not much more than that.
And if we go to the top email on the page, Alistair Whitehead to Lorna Grattan in response 2 minutes later, PM speaking to Sajid directly now, essentially making that point and asking what we can do to support RBKC. Now, you cover this at paragraph 40 of your first statement on page 14, if we can go to it. And you refer to this email traffic and you provide a readout there of the call. You say a response was sent just before 1500. Now, why is that? Why was it not sent before that?
Well, I think it was quite a long request with quite a tight deadline on exactly what the department's role was, what was going on, and I think it took a while for that information to be collated.
Because I think it's right, isn't it, that the Secretary of State, APS, Assistant Private Secretary, had actually asked for a response by 2 p.m.
Yes.
Yes.
It strikes me when I look at that request that it was quite a big one for such a tight deadline, if I'm honest.
Well, let's look at what you sent back. CLG 403194. Here's the note. And it's a one-page document confirming the function of RED and what RED had been doing. And I'm summarising very briefly, but that's right, isn't it?
Well, towards the end, it talks more about DCLG's support on funding. For example, I think we'd mobilised Belwyn by Thursday morning. At least it agreed with the council that we were mobilising it. And also that we were discussing the provision of emergency accommodation. But yes, I think this is a rather RED-centred response. And I think that this document, or this request, was actioned to RED. And to be honest, I would have expected a slightly broader response. I think it's a bit narrow and doesn't really relate to the breadth of the issues that the department was dealing with in terms of the emergency response.
Yes. I mean, well, at risk of pedantry, it also doesn't refer to the building correctly, does it?
No, it doesn't. And I find that, as I see it throughout the documents, very jarring. And I'm sure that those directly involved in the fire must find it potentially quite offensive and very difficult, and I'm very sorry about that. It just is it's an oversight which I can't really explain, because I know I was calling it Grenfell Tower right from the very beginning on Wednesday, so I don't know how it came to be that Grenfell House was used for so long.
And does it tell us anything about the degree of engagement of your officials?
No, I don't think so, but no, I don't think it does, but it perhaps speaks to a certain level of stretch that was going on in the teams. This doesn't look to me like it's a note that's had a very great deal of senior oversight or checking. And, it goes to what I was saying earlier, that I think, and what's in my witness statement, that I think RED mobilised to do the job that RED was supposed to do. But what the department was not really ready for was that the job that the department was supposed to do on the areas of our responsibility, including housing, but also a wider role in recovery. And we were not prepared for that, and we did not have the structures within the department to be able to action and deal with requests properly. And I think this is a symptom of that. I would also say, though, that You know, it isn't always helpful in situations like this when the centre asks for a note on something, when you're actually trying to deal in real time with the issues. So it's a rather clunky way of asking for information, and I think what came back was a rather clunky and not particularly impressive response.
If we look at the fifth paragraph down under Grenfell House activity, which starts the whole local authority, you see the paragraph there in the centre of the screen. It says the whole local authority is involved in the response alongside key partners organised in line with their emergency response protocol. An offer was made for DCLG staff to attend our BKC offices. This was not felt to be useful. Do you know why that was the case?
No, just to be clear, my understanding is that this was an offer made by DCLG for our staff to attend, and it was refused by the local authorities. When I first saw this document, I thought it was the other way around, but I think it is that we made the offer to them.
Yes.
I don't know why they refused it. I think they were very defensive, really almost from the very beginning, and were unable to see really quite how much help they needed. And I think that they were particularly defensive about central government coming along and telling them what to do and getting involved.
Now, can we go then to CAB 30?
Could I just add, what's missing from this note is any mention of whether or not the London resilience arrangements have been engaged. And for me, that is a gap in the way that we were thinking about this, that we weren't looking to see if that had happened. We were relying on it, but we weren't looking to see whether it had happened. And I think that's one of the big gaps that I feel Joe and I and others didn't fill in those early days, is checking that those arrangements were there. And you can see that in this note. It wasn't part of the conversation. Right. And they weren't invited to the Wednesday afternoon meeting of ministers either.
Now, looking back on the conversation you had with at 9:30 that morning with the Secretary of State, and also on the email we saw earlier from Joe Beck about rehousing, did the subject of Nicholas Holgate potentially reaching out to the Pan-London arrangements, at least so far as rehousing was concerned, come up during that conversation?
I don't think so, no.
Can you explain why that is?
Well, as I said, I think it was a gap in our thinking that we should really have been thinking more, and I think Red should have thought about it. I think Joe and I should have thought about it, about whether or not London Gold were involved in the way that we would have expected was necessary given the scale of this emergency.
Now, can we go then to CAB 3014859? We've already touched on the conversation between the Prime Minister and Sajid Javid on that morning. Here is a readout of that at 9:29 from Lorna Grattan. Internally, you're not on it, but let me just show you parts of it. And the timing is, I would assume, just before your meeting with the Secretary of State, which you say took place at 9:30, so 1 minute later. The PM spoke to the Communities Secretary on the topic of the Grenfell Tower fire. The PM noted that commentary in the media this morning reported that the operation to look after the victims was less than well organised. The PM asked what Sajid knew about this and what further we can do to support K&C, who are leading the effort. Sajid said he had no reports for it being disorganised. CLG stood up emergency response within a couple of hours and had called K&C leader and the mayor. Both indicated that they had what they needed. The mayor had urged CLG to focus on rehousing and that it should be very local. Sajid agreed with that and said that the government would provide funding to facilitate this if necessary. They had agreed that when the emergency had settled down, they would further discuss the necessary recovery efforts. Sadiq and Nicholas, K&C leader, had both been told that they should call Sajid directly if they need anything, i.e. not go through officials if that delayed things. CLG team are still on the ground at the site. Now, can you account for the Secretary of State, Sajid Javid, having no reports for it being disorganised, as he says, or as is said of him?
I think that is the information that we had on the Wednesday night and at the start of Thursday morning. We didn't have reports of it being disorganised. He had spoken to the leader and the mayor. Alok Sharma had also spoken to the leader, and we were not getting through those channels or through red channels any of the reports that began to emerge on Thursday morning. So I read this email and I've not seen, this is number 10's record of that conversation. I'd not seen it before.
No, of course.
But in what Sajid Javid is saying in that second paragraph, that seems to me to be a faithful description of what the department thought was going on Wednesday night, and it was on Thursday morning that began to change.
I mean, we've seen the email from Sir Jeremy Hayward to you about the reports coming to him that RBKC was not gripping this tightly.
Yes.
Are you able to explain why the Secretary of State did not know that when speaking to the Prime Minister a little bit later, not much later, but a little bit later that morning?
I don't know when the conversation was between the Secretary of State and the Prime Minister and whether it came after my email from Jeremy Hayward.
9:10, about 9:10, and then this is the readout from it, but just before your meeting with the Secretary of State. But we also saw the email from earlier that morning from Sir Jeremy to you, telling you about RBKC not getting a grip. So would you accept that there appears to have been some kind of breakdown in the communication line between number 10, the Cabinet Office, and your department about what was actually happening on the ground?
No, I don't think it was a breakdown of communication. I think that number 10, and I'm not sure from quite which sources, but number 10 were very clear, and I'm sure Jeremy Hayward will have been talking to the Prime Minister about this and probably part of the early morning meetings in number 10 on that Thursday morning. They were very consistent in their concerns. Jeremy emailed me about them, and the Prime Minister raised them directly with the Secretary of State. I didn't, as far as I recall, forward that email to the Secretary of State, but at least not before his meeting with the Prime Minister. But I don't think there was a breakdown of communication. I think they communicated very clearly to us, something which we were not aware of at the time. But we were becoming aware of it quite quickly.
Yes. In fact, it's the case, isn't it, that at this point, the DCLG had not contributed anything to the response on the ground beyond offering help, which had been refused.
I think the team that Sajid Javid is referring to there is the red team.
Right, I see.
And that was there.
Right. Now, if we go, please, to CAB 406264, we move forward in time. I think you've already covered this to some extent, but here is an email from Lorna Grattan to Alistair Whitehead at 17:32 that day about further help. We've asked them to look into further support, e.g. secondees would be welcome from the LA. And then, as you told us, that did happen, but not until some days later, I think. Lizzie Clifford to Westminster and Fiona Darby on the 18th of June, 17th and 18th of June, respectively.
In response to questions from the inquiry, I provided a full list of all those seconded in my second witness statement. I believe that Lizzie Clifford and Fiona Darby started working with the council on the Thursday, but not actually in the council buildings, but they began to work with them, I believe, on the Thursday afternoon.
Now, coming back to the morning of that day, let's go to CLG 403084. And this is an email from your office to Nicholas Holgate. Call with Melanie Dawes at DCLG is the subject. And the diary manager writes to Nicholas Holgate and says, Melanie has asked if you might be available later this morning to speak. Melanie is currently in a meeting with the Secretary of State that is due to finish around 10:15. Now that's the meeting that started at 9:30, I think, is it?
Yes.
Did you get a response to this?
I don't think so, no.
Were you concerned that your office was unable to arrange this call?
Yes. And Joe Farrer spoke to Nicholas a little bit later on that morning, finally.
Right.
That was the first time that either of us had spoken to him.
Right. What had prompted your desire to speak to him?
The concerns about what was going on the ground.
That had come to
must have been part of it. And also just a general feeling that it was appropriate for me to speak to the local authority lead, and he hadn't been in contact the previous day. So I think in any circumstances I would have wanted to have a chat with him that morning, but particularly given the concerns, I think it was essential.
Then chronologically, the next thing I think is at CLG 403102, 10:36 that morning, 15th of June, CLG 403102, and this is a note to self, essentially. Second email down at 10:36. RBKC update from Joe. That's Joe Farrer. And there are 4 bullet points. There was quick responses in terms of providing temporary accommodation last night. The task for today and tomorrow is finding more permanent homes. Our team is in contact with the Director of Housing, who is holding a meeting and will report back after 11 a.m. There is a strategic coordinating group at 11 a.m. where this will be discussed. Our staff are on this group. Now, in relation to the first 3 of those, temporary accommodation, more permanent homes, did that reflect the concerns that you had or had heard that morning?
I don't quite know where Joe's update had come from or what she was particularly aiming to inform me of that I wasn't already aware of. But I think those first 2 bullets are consistent with where we were on the Wednesday night, which is that we hadn't been asked for help on temporary accommodation, and as far as we were aware, there had been a quick response, and that the task that we were particularly helping them on was providing more permanent homes, and that's very consistent with where the department was.
Did you manage to speak to Nicholas Holgate at all before the cross-ministerial meeting at 4 o'clock that day? At
No.
3:30
No, I didn't.
that day? You didn't? Now, we know that Joe Farrer did, I think. If we go, please, to CLG. Well, let me preface that. Can we look at her witness statement? CLG 3030653, page 16, paragraph 50, first of all. This is where she deals with that call, and she and this is you, actually, your statement. You say there, Joe Farrer spoke with him shortly after midday. Her office circulated a readout of that call, yes?
Yes.
And then let's look at that. CLG 408140. And if we turn to page 2 in that email run, second email down, at 16:26, that's the end of it. I think we want page 1. It straddles the page. Thank you. 16:26 from your office to MHCLG Red and also Sajid Javid's office. Read out Joe's calls with LGA and Chief Executive K&C. For information, please see readouts of Joe's calls today with Mark Lloyd, LGA, and Nick Holgate. And you can see that there are a readout of 2 calls, I think. The first is at 12:30, 15th of June, where Joe Farrer has a call with Nick Holgate. You see that?
Yes.
And if you go to the top of page 2, during the call, Nicholas Holgate is reported as saying that RBKC was receiving plenty of support from DCLG and others. You see that?
Yes.
Risks, if a lot of people come back who can't get into their homes, getting people into permanent homes in an orderly and quick way, post-traumatic stress. And then if we go up to page 1 again, please. He says in the first bullet point there, or is noted as having said, they have found hotel accommodation for anyone with need. He thinks that can roll over for as long as needed. Now, do you remember reading this email at the time?
Yes.
You do. What was the impression you were left with? Do you remember?
I can't quite remember when I read it, but if I only saw it after the time that it's stated in this particular version of it, i.e. 1626, then by then I would have been extremely worried about the council and have thought that this was really, I'm afraid, a sign that Nicholas Holgate was not gripping the situation and didn't really understand what was going on.
Why? Because of the discrepancy between...
Yes.
Right.
And in particular, the fact that there was plenty of help on the second page there from DCLG when we knew that they hadn't really asked for any help.
Indeed, on the contrary, had resisted it.
Yeah. What we didn't know at the time, I think, was quite how problematic the hotel accommodation was that had already been provided, and how many issues there were with things like food, and also about the uncertainty about how long people were able to stay there. So he's saying that can roll over for as long as needed. What we know now is that wasn't necessarily the case. But at the time, there were still plenty of signs that this just felt complacent. And I think that was Joe's view. My guess is that Joe and I talked about this before I even read the readout, and that she conveyed her concern.
Now, if you look about 3/4 of the way down that bullet point list, you can see there's a reference there to 845 non-Grenfell Tower households are currently without access to their homes. Most are making their own arrangements. They are looking at when police and fire can reduce the size of the cordon. Did you read that as homes or households or individuals? Do you remember?
I don't think I really thought about that difference.
No. Did the scale of the problem become apparent to you reading that?
Yes. I don't remember exactly when it was that the Lancaster West estate issues really began to become evident to us. But they were clearly very serious in the scale of the number of people who were homeless, temporarily homeless, or in some cases it turned out to be permanently homeless. I don't quite remember when that crystallised. This may have been one of the first indications of it. I don't remember.
Now let's just look at the next 2 bullet points. Grenfell Tower residents have been complaining for a long time about the council. They have a trail of letters written to the council. Nick said several people could make this worse than it is, and the council is worried that they might need assistance from the police. What was your understanding of what that was about, those 2 bullet points, whether taken together or separately?
Well, I don't really know. I see it now as a sign of their defensiveness, that, you know, obviously there had been a lot of complaints about the tower and about other housing, and that perhaps had led to a certain, perhaps siege mentality even in the council, in how they responded to those residents. That's how I interpret it. I don't think I can say any more than that. I don't want to overinterpret what Nicholas Holgate was saying there.
Was it your perception at the time, and I don't want to put words into your mouth, but you refer to siege mentality, was it your perception at the time that the relationship between the residents and the council as recorded here might have had some kind of influence on the way in which Nicholas Holgate was approaching offers of help from outside?
Yes, possibly. I mean, I should say that although I don't know Nicholas Holgate very well, he is, you know, a man, I believe, of integrity and actually a very kind man. And I don't in any way interpret his actions in these few days as somebody who didn't care or who wasn't trying to do the right thing. I think he was completely overwhelmed by the task, not perhaps with the operational background in local government that might have helped him. He was a policy official from the Treasury originally, and he, in the moment, didn't realise he needed to call for help. And I mean, perhaps, you know, this is the right moment to raise this, but I think it is very difficult to know how you help somebody in that kind of situation, because the last thing you want to do is to stop people leading when they need to lead and get on with it. But when somebody is under stress and they don't realise they need help, they're usually the last person to see it. So I don't think you can rely on people under pressure to know when they have to be, as he was, removed from the situation because they're unable to discharge those responsibilities. So I think he was in a very difficult position, and all sorts of factors were making it very difficult for him to lead the council in the way that was needed.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, is that a convenient moment?
Yes, I think it is. I think it's time we stopped so we can all get some lunch. So we'll break there. We'll resume, please, at 2:05. And as before, please don't talk to anyone about your evidence over the break. All right?
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Millett. 2:05 then, please.
Thank you.
Okay.